My name is Melody Castro. I am 36 years old. 2 weeks ago, I sat outside the glass walls of an Allentown executive conference room and watched my older brother Derek uncap his silver pen. He was getting ready to sign away $4 million of our family business. He wore that smug, practiced smile he always saved for moments when he thought he was the smartest man in the room. What he did not know was that the pen was entirely useless. He also did not realize the senior commercial lender staring across the mahogany table was actually waiting for me. When the banker finally spoke, asking the majority shareholder to step inside and sign my brother's pen froze halfway to the paper. My father stopped breathing. My mother's practiced smile melted into stark terror. That was the exact moment my family realized the daughter they had treated like a glorified secretary for a decade secretly owned 51% of their company. Before I tell you how this all unraveled, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Jessica Told Stories, but only if this narrative genuinely keeps you listening. It is the best way for these stories to reach the people who need to hear them. I would also love to know your age and where in the world you are tuning in from, so drop that in the comments below. Now let me take you back a couple of weeks to a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. The dining room smelled of slow-roasted pork and the lingering scent of my father's cigars. Hector Castro sat at the head of the table, his chest puffed out under a crisp linen shirt. He raised his crystal glass, the ice clinking softly in the quiet room, and pointed it directly at Derek. "To the boy who secured the tri-state logistics route," my father announced, his voice booming with pride. "A true executive." My mother Elena beamed from her seat, patting Derek on the shoulder as if he had just conquered a nation. I sat at the opposite end of the table, staring at the prime rib on my plate. A dull, familiar ache settled behind my ribs. I was the one who won that route. I spent 3 sleepless nights buried in supply chain margins, analyzing diesel consumption rates and driver union regulations across the Appalachian corridors to undercut our competitors by a fraction of a cent per mile. My neck still ached from staring at the spreadsheets. Derek had not even read the final proposal until I printed it, placed it in a leather folder, and handed it to him before his meeting. The margin actually worked because we recalculated the deadhead miles on the return trips, I said, keeping my tone measured. We streamlined the route so the drivers never come back empty. My father slapped his palm against the table. The silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. "Do not steal your brother's thunder, Melody." He pointed a thick finger at me. "You crunch numbers. He builds relationships." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, tarnished brass key. It was the original key my grandfather used to unlock the chain-link gates of Castro Freight decades ago. A family heirloom, a symbol of leadership. My father slid it across the white tablecloth until it rested next to Derek's wine glass. It was a coronation. We survived the bad years because we played ball with those sharks at Penn Iron Capital. My father continued leaning back in his chair. He spoke of the anonymous private equity firm with a strange mixture of reverence and fear. They hold the proxy, but they let us steer. And now Derek is steering us into the future. I took a slow sip of my water. My father worshipped a board of phantom Philadelphia financiers who he believed saved him from bankruptcy 7 years ago. He did not know that Penn Iron Capital was just a shell corporation registered to a pristine post office box. He did not know the sole managing director was sitting at his dinner table, quietly eating her vegetables, while her brother played pretend with her empire. My silent labor was being erased to feed a fragile ego. But math has a funny way of demanding a reckoning, and the ledger was about to balance itself. To grasp the sheer scale of the delusion radiating from that dining room table, you have to rewind 7 years. I was 25, working long shifts auditing regional healthcare networks when a frantic phone call dragged me to the intensive care unit at Lehigh Valley Hospital. My father lay in a tangled web of cardiac monitors, his skin the color of wet ash. A stress-induced heart attack had nearly stopped his heart, but it was the company ledger that was truly flatlining. While he slept under heavy sedation, I drove to his office and opened the books. The reality was a cold splash of water. Castro Freight was bleeding cash. Fuel vendors were preparing to file liens. The bank was drafting foreclosure notices for the trucking fleet. My father had masked the rot with sheer stubbornness, but pride does not pay commercial loans. I knew Hector Castro. I knew the fragile, towering ego of a self-made man who built a trucking fleet out of Pennsylvania dirt. If his 25-year-old daughter offered to bail him out with her own savings, the shame would have given him a second heart attack. He needed a savior wrapped in a corporate suit, an entity intimidating enough to let him save face. 3 days later, I sat in a sterile, glass-walled law firm overlooking downtown Philadelphia. The air conditioning hummed a low, freezing note while I signed away my entire future. I liquidated my early retirement accounts, drained my savings, and took out a heavy personal loan leveraged against my future earnings. Every dollar I had scraped together went into a blind holding company. I named it Penn Iron Capital. My lawyer drafted a ruthless, airtight equity purchase agreement. Penn Iron Capital infused the exact amount of cash needed to satisfy the creditors, securing a 51% controlling interest in Castro Freight. To keep my father blind to my involvement, I structured the deal to grant him proxy voting rights, allowing him to maintain day-to-day operational control as long as the margins stayed in the black. When the bank accepted the transfer, my father wept in his hospital bed, thanking the invisible Philadelphia sharks who threw him a lifeline. He never looked at the daughter sitting quietly in the visitor chair beside him. That secret lived in the shadows for 7 years, untouched until yesterday morning. The scent of heavy diesel exhaust and stale break room coffee hung in the air of our primary distribution warehouse. 80 truck drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers gathered around a makeshift stage constructed from wooden pallets. My father stood at the microphone, looking healthier and more invincible than he had in a decade. Today marks a new era for Castro Freight. He projected his voice, echoing off the corrugated steel roof. I brought this company out of the mud, but passing the torch requires vision. It requires a leader who knows how to navigate the modern supply chain. My mother stepped up to the microphone next, adjusting her silk scarf. She looked out over the crowd of blue-collar workers and pointed directly at my brother. Derek is the reason we made it through the dark times, she announced, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. He poured his soul into keeping this family afloat. He steered us through the storm. I stood near the open bay doors at the back of the building, the autumn wind biting at my wrists. I crossed my arms, my fingertips pressing hard into the sleeves of my coat. I watched my family rewrite history in real time. Derek had been in his 3rd year of avoiding a real job when the company almost went under. He spent that summer taking a vague sabbatical backpacking across Europe, while I was sitting in a lawyer's office, trading my youth for a wire transfer. Now he jogged up the steps of the pallet stage, waving to the crowd like a conquering hero. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most of the mechanics made in a month. Hector officially handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer. The applause roared through the warehouse, a thunderous validation of a lie. Derek stepped up to the microphone, radiating a practiced, polished charm. He knew how to hold a room. He possessed a dangerous kind of charisma, the sort that made people want to believe him, even when his lips were moving. We have a lot of winning to do, Derek told the crowd, flashing a bright white smile. We are looking at unprecedented growth. Now, I know some of you saw the numbers from the last quarter and noticed a slight dip in the revenue streams. Do not let that worry you. That is just market recalibration. We are leveraging new synergies in the spot market and optimizing our regional footprint. It is all part of the upward trajectory. The drivers nodded, soothed by the confident rhythm of his voice. My parents beamed with profound, unconditional pride from the side of the stage. I stood in the shadows, holding a tablet loaded with the raw, unfiltered data from the accounting server. There was no market recalibration. There were no synergies. I stared at the screen, the harsh blue light reflecting in my eyes. The math was screaming. Over the past 8 months, Derek had been slowly restructuring the internal reporting software. He isolated the localized profit and loss statements from the regional hubs, manually altering the data before it fed into Hector's aggregate executive dashboard. To my father, the company looked lean and profitable. To anyone reading the raw data, the company was hemorrhaging capital at an alarming rate. Derek was not a business genius. He was a manipulator who knew exactly which buttons to push to keep a proud, aging founder comfortable. He fed Hector a steady diet of green arrows and upward graphs, hiding a terrifying operational deficit behind corporate jargon. I scrolled through the actual ledgers, feeling a cold knot pull tight in my stomach. The minor dip in quarterly revenue Derek just brushed off was actually a staggering loss. Operating expenses had spiked. Unexplained vendor payouts were draining the reserve accounts. The numbers did not match the routes we were running. I looked up from the screen. Derek was shaking hands with the lead mechanic, laughing loudly at a joke. My father patted him on the back. My mother looked at him like he was the sun itself. I was forced to swallow a very bitter pill in that echoing warehouse. My parents did not care about the truth. The truth was sharp, complex, and unglamorous. They preferred a comfortable, beautiful lie spoken by a son over the hard, mathematical reality delivered by a daughter. They wanted the narrative where their golden boy saved the legacy. I locked the tablet and slipped it into my bag. I told myself I could fix the deficit quietly, just like I fixed the bankruptcy 7 years ago. I thought I could manage Derek from the shadows, adjusting the budgets and cutting costs before he caused permanent damage. I still believed, in some naive corner of my heart, that keeping my family safe was worth the cost of my own erasure. I had no idea how deep the rot truly went. I did not realize that Derek was not just mismanaging the company, but actively treating it like a personal bank. And I certainly did not expect the lengths my parents would go to protect his delusion, a dynamic that would rear its ugly head just 3 days later, when a simple networking event turned into a humiliating public exile and a terrifying realization on the loading dock. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon when my mother strolled into my cramped office near the dispatch bay. She carried a stack of silver-embossed envelopes, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the linoleum floor. The annual Pennsylvania Logistics Gala was 3 days away. Held in a grand, soaring ballroom in downtown Philadelphia, this event served as the beating heart of our industry networking. For half a decade, I was the sole representative for Castro Freight. I shook the hands, memorized the names of our clients' children, and secured the vital handshake agreements that kept our freight haulers moving through the lean winter months. I had already retrieved my formal gown from the dry cleaners. I had my seasonal routing talking points perfectly memorized. Elena set one envelope on the corner of my desk, keeping her palm resting flat against the heavy cardstock. She wore a tailored beige suit, looking far more like a wealthy country club patron than the wife of a gritty freight boss. "We are making a few adjustments to the seating chart this year," she said, her tone as smooth and cold as river glass. I looked up from my dual monitors, pausing my keystrokes. Adjustments? Derek invited a new vendor to sit at our table, she explained, tapping her manicured nail against the silver paper. A regional supplier who plays golf at his country club. He needs that seat, Melody. Derek needs to project executive presence. He is the face of the operation now. I stared at her, keeping my breathing slow and measured. I managed the routing accounts for every single client sitting at that table. If they ask detailed distribution questions, Derek will not know the answers. He does not know the seasonal load limits or the union rest requirements. My mother offered a thin, pitying smile. They do not want to talk about tire tread wear and dispatch technicalities at a black-tie dinner, sweetheart. They want to talk about the future. Derek paints a beautiful picture of the future. You are wonderful at what you do, but you are the back office help. Let your brother handle the spotlight. She pulled the envelope back, slipping it carefully into her leather tote bag. The message rang loud and undeniable. I did not fit the pristine, victorious narrative they were crafting for the world. My presence, quiet and analytical, reminded them of the gritty reality they were trying to escape. I was expected to stay hidden in the shadows, crunching the numbers that funded their delusions of grandeur. I did not argue. Arguing with my mother was akin to punching a brick wall. You only end up breaking your own knuckles. I simply turned my attention back to my glowing monitors and let her walk out the door. Instead of attending the gala that Saturday evening, I drove down to the freight yard. The facility sat on the industrial edge of Allentown, surrounded by rusting chain-link fences and the distant, constant hum of the interstate. It was normally deserted on weekends. The crisp autumn air tasted of metallic dust and old diesel fuel. I unlocked the main gate and walked into the silent warehouse, pulling my wool coat tight against the October chill. I booted up my terminal in the empty dispatch office, intending to review the manifest logs for the upcoming week. The silence of the yard was supposed to be a comfort, a quiet sanctuary where numbers told the truth and human egos held no power over the outcome. An hour into my review, the roar of a heavy diesel engine shattered the quiet. I stood up, peering through the dirt-smudged window of the office door. A flatbed tow truck painted bright cautionary yellow was backing down the main concrete ramp toward our loading dock. A man in a high-visibility jacket hopped out of the cab. He carried a thick metal clipboard and a length of heavy towing chain slung over his shoulder. I hurried out of the office, my boots echoing across the cavernous floor. "Can I help you?" I called out, my breath pluming in the freezing air. The man did not even look my way. He walked straight toward our primary Caterpillar forklift, the heavy-duty machine we used to load the triple-weight freight pallets onto the flatbeds. "I'm here for the cat," he grunted, unspooling the heavy steel chain. 60 days past due on the equipment lease. The bank ordered a repossession. My stomach dropped into a bottomless gorge. That forklift was the spine of our Monday morning loading sequence. Without it, 36 rigs would sit idle in the yard missing their departure windows. Missing windows meant breached delivery contracts, and breached contracts meant crippling financial penalties that could wipe out a month of profit. "There has to be a mistake," I said, stepping directly between the man and the machine. "We auto-pay that lease on the 1st of every month." The repo agent finally looked at me, his eyes tired and unsympathetic. He held out the metal clipboard. "No mistake, lady. The last 2 bank drafts bounced due to insufficient funds. My orders are to chain it and drag it. Unless you have $5,000 in certified funds sitting in your pocket right now, step aside." My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my throat. Derek was the one who authorized the accounts payable drafts. A skipped payment of this size was not a clerical oversight. It was a glaring red flag waving over a burning building. I looked at the towering yellow machine, then at the tow truck idling on the ramp. If that forklift left the yard, Castro Freight would bleed thousands of dollars by noon on Monday. My family was currently sipping champagne in a Philadelphia ballroom, utterly oblivious to the fire spreading through their own house. I pulled my wallet from my coat pocket. If I pay the arrears right now over the phone with a personal debit card, will you drop the chain?" The man paused, chewing on the inside of his cheek, weighing the hassle. "If the card clears, I leave the machine." I stood, shivering in the freezing warehouse, dialed the recovery agency on my cell phone, and read off the 16 digits of my personal checking account. I listened to the automated voice confirm a transfer of $5,000. It was money I had carefully saved for my own property taxes, vaporized in an instant to cover my brother's tracks. The repo agent got the confirmation call on his radio, offered a curt nod, threw his chains back into his truck, and drove away. The silence returned to the yard, but it was no longer a comfort. It was suffocating. I walked slowly back to the dispatch office. My hands shook as I unlocked the administrative server. A missed payment of that magnitude meant our primary operating account was running on fumes. I needed to see exactly where the cash was flowing, and I needed to see it now. I bypassed Derek's polished, curated executive dashboard and dug directly into the raw, unfiltered expense reports. I spent the next 4 hours tracing individual line items, cross-referencing invoice numbers, and following the digital paper trail left behind by my brother's reckless spending. The horrifying truth began to crystallize on the glowing screen. There were dozens of highly irregular vendor payments categorized vaguely as consulting fees or strategic logistics advisement. These disbursements were bypassing our standard vendor approval protocols entirely. They were authorized directly by the Chief Executive Officer. I ran the routing numbers associated with those consulting firms. They were not logistics experts. They were shell companies, limited liability corporations registered to obscure residential addresses in Scranton. My minor social exclusion from a corporate dinner had just pivoted into a terrifying financial discovery. I was no longer looking at a brother struggling to manage a business. I was looking at a predator, actively dismantling it from the inside. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the dual monitors casting long, harsh shadows across the dark office. My parents had told me I lacked the vision to understand the future of Castro Freight. They told me to stay in the back office and crunch the numbers. So I did. I utilized the precise analytical forensic accounting skills that my family so openly despised. I began unraveling the tangled web of Derek's shell companies, hunting down every stolen dollar, unknowingly gathering the exact ammunition required to shatter their fragile, fraudulent reality. The true horror, however, was not just where the money was going. The real nightmare waiting in the ledgers was what Derek had used as collateral to get it. Monday morning hit the dispatch yard like a hammer. The rumble of idling Peterbilt engines shook the thin drywall of my office. I sat at my desk, a cold cup of coffee resting next to my keyboard, my eyes burning from staring at the financial discrepancies I had unearthed over the weekend. The repo scare was a tourniquet. I had stopped the immediate bleeding, but the patient was still dying on the operating table. Vince, our lead dispatcher, tapped his knuckles against my open door frame. He was a veteran of the Pennsylvania highways, a man who had hauled freight for my father back when Castro Freight was just 3 trucks and a rented dirt lot. His face wore the deep lines of a lifetime spent squinting into the glare of the sun. He stepped inside, dropping a stack of fuel receipts onto my desk. He did not say good morning. He just tapped a calloused finger against the top paper. "Something is wrong with the weekend routes." Vince grunted, his voice rough like gravel. "I ran the numbers twice. The math refuses to behave." I pulled the stack toward me. "What are you seeing, Vince?" He leaned against the filing cabinet, crossing his arms over his chest. "I dispatched 6 rigs up the Interstate 81 corridor toward Syracuse on Saturday. The manifests say they hauled empty pallets on the return trip. Ghost weight. But look at the pump tickets from the truck stops." I scanned the printed receipts. The diesel volume was staggering. "According to these gallons," Vince continued, his eyes narrowing, Those rigs were pulling maximum gross vehicle weight up a 12-degree incline for 400 miles. But the weigh station tickets confirmed they were empty. You cannot cheat physics, Melody. Derek has these trucks running light, but they are burning heavy fuel. It makes 0 sense. A sharp chill crawled down my spine. The discrepancy was not a clerical glitch. It was a neon sign pointing directly toward a sophisticated theft. I thanked Vince, assuring him I would audit the fuel cards, and waited until he closed the door behind him. I turned the deadbolt. The brass click echoed in the small room. I pulled down the vinyl blinds, shutting out the view of the busy yard, and booted up the master fleet tracking software. Forensic accounting is rarely about finding a smoking gun sitting in plain sight. It is about searching for negative space. You look for the shadow cast by the missing money. I began cross-referencing the GPS coordinates of our trucks against the timestamps on the corporate fuel cards. The deception unspooled across my dual monitors, cold and undeniable. The trucks were never at the fueling stations in Syracuse. The satellite data proved our fleet was parked in a secondary overflow lot just outside of Scranton, during the exact hours the diesel purchases were authorized. Someone was cloning the corporate fuel cards. They were buying thousands of gallons of diesel on our dime, draining the operational accounts, and reselling the fuel on the black market. I followed the digital footprint of those cloned card authorizations. The payments routed through a third-party payment processor, washing the funds before depositing them into the regional bank accounts of the same vague consulting firms I had discovered on Saturday. The shell companies. My brother was not just inflating his expense account. He was operating an intricate, premeditated laundering syndicate right under my father's nose. But fuel theft alone did not explain the sheer volume of cash missing from our primary reserves. The math still felt incomplete. I dug deeper, logging into the Pennsylvania Department of State Business Registry. I searched the tax identification numbers of the phantom consulting firms. I pierced the corporate veil of 3 different limited liability companies, peeling back the layers of registered agents and proxy addresses until I found the underlying benefactor, Derek Castro. He was the sole managing member of every single shell company. My chest tightened. The air in the office felt thin, insufficient for my lungs. I pulled the property records for Lackawanna County, matching the company names to real estate deeds. Derek was quietly purchasing failing commercial properties throughout Scranton. Abandoned strip malls, half-empty office parks with crumbling asphalt parking lots, properties that required millions of dollars in renovation capital just to bring them up to code. He was trying to build a real estate empire, playing the role of a high-rolling developer at the country club, while funding his disastrous acquisitions with stolen freight money. I sat back in my chair, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes. The audacity was breathtaking. But the final piece of the puzzle remained hidden. Even with the laundered fuel money, Derek did not have enough liquid cash to close on multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deals. He needed leverage. He needed collateral to secure the mortgages for those Scranton strip malls. A terrifying suspicion took root in my mind. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the Uniform Commercial Code Public Filings database. I typed in the legal operating name of Castro Freight. The search results populated instantly. My stomach plummeted. There were 6 active liens filed against our rolling stock. Derek had quietly taken out high-interest mezzanine loans from aggressive shadow lenders using our entire fleet of Peterbilt trucks as collateral. He had literally bet the company farm. The stakes violently shifted in my mind. This was no longer a story about emotional neglect or a bruised ego. It was not about who got the credit for a logistics contract or who received an invitation to a fancy Philadelphia gala. This was a story about imminent, inescapable financial ruin. If Derek's crumbling real estate investments failed to generate revenue, which the market data guaranteed they would, he would default on those shadow loans. The moment he missed a single payment, the predatory lenders would execute the liens. They would send an army of tow trucks to our Allentown yard and seize the entire fleet. Castro Freight would cease to exist overnight. I looked past the edge of my lowered blinds, watching the activity in the yard. Mechanics covered in grease were swapping out brake pads on a trailer. Dispatchers were barking orders into radios. Drivers were climbing into their cabs, clutching thermoses of coffee, preparing for grueling long-haul routes to keep a roof over their families' heads. 80 blue-collar workers trusted my family. 80 families relied on the paychecks generated by this yard to pay their mortgages, fund their children's braces, and keep their own lives afloat. Derek was gambling with their survival. He viewed these people as disposable pawns in his twisted game of Monopoly. My brother treated the family business like his personal piggy bank, assuming there would be no consequences because our parents had shielded him from accountability since birth. He thought he was untouchable because he wore the title of Chief Executive Officer. He forgot about the girl in the back office. I printed the public filings, the property deeds, and the routing discrepancies. The paper slid out of the tray, warm to the touch. Each document felt heavier than the last. I compiled the evidence into a thick manila folder. My forensic audit was no longer just a spreadsheet. It was a ticking time bomb, wired to detonate under the very foundation of my family's legacy. I held the detonator. The urge to march into Derek's plush corner office and throw the folder at his chest burned hot in my veins. I wanted to watch his smug facade shatter. I wanted to hear him try to spin his way out of federal fraud charges using his empty corporate buzzwords. But confronting a narcissist in his own castle is a tactical error. Derek would simply deny the allegations, confiscate the documents, and manipulate our father into firing me on the spot for insubordination. He would spin a web of lies faster than I could expose the truth. I needed an ally. I needed someone inside the family to see the raw danger before the bank stripped us down to the copper wiring. My father was too blinded by his pride, too enchanted by the illusion of his son's success to listen to reason. That left only one option. I picked up the manila folder and slid it into my leather briefcase. I waited until the end of the shift, letting the sun dip below the Appalachian Ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the freight yard. I drove straight to my parents' house in the suburbs. The windows glowed with warm, inviting light, masking the profound dysfunction breathing inside those walls. I parked in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I prepared myself to walk into the kitchen and show my mother the exact price of her blind devotion. I pushed the heavy oak front door open, the familiar brass chime echoing through the expansive foyer. The house smelled of roasted garlic, fresh rosemary, and expensive vanilla candles. It was the scent of a perfect, undisturbed suburban sanctuary. Framed photographs lined the hallway walls, capturing smiling vacations and holiday dinners, a carefully curated gallery of a flawless family. I walked past the smiling faces, feeling the weight of the manila folder burning against my ribs. My mother stood at the sprawling granite kitchen island, meticulously trimming the stems of imported white hydrangeas with silver shears. She wore a cream cashmere sweater, a delicate string of pearls resting against her collarbone. The kitchen was a magazine spread of gleaming stainless steel and pristine white cabinets. It was a fortress of domestic tranquility, funded entirely by the gritty diesel smoke and grinding gears of the Allentown freight yard. Elena did not look up from her floral arrangement as I walked into the room. She simply hummed a quiet tune, discarding the cut stems into the porcelain sink. I stopped across the island from her. I did not offer a greeting. I unclasped my leather briefcase, pulled out the thick manila folder, and set it flat on the polished stone countertop. The dull thud of the paper hitting the granite broke the quiet rhythm of the room. "I need you to look at this," I said, my voice low and steady. Elena paused, the silver shears hovering over a fresh green stem. She glanced at the unremarkable folder, then back up to my face. Her pristine brow furrowed in mild annoyance, the look a monarch might give a servant interrupting afternoon tea. "I am preparing the centerpiece for your father's Rotary Club dinner, Melody," she said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "Whatever payroll issue you are struggling with down at the yard can wait until Monday. Derek will handle it." "Derek is the issue," I replied, keeping my hands resting flat on the edges of the folder. "I spent the weekend running a forensic audit on the primary operating accounts. The company is bleeding cash, Mom." She sighed, a sharp intake of breath designed to convey her profound patience. I opened the cover of the folder, revealing the top page. It was a printed spreadsheet highlighting the phantom fuel authorizations and the corresponding GPS coordinates of our grounded fleet. "He is cloning the corporate fuel cards," I explained, pointing to the highlighted columns. "He is charging thousands of gallons of diesel to the company, but the trucks are parked idle in a secondary lot. He is laundering the operating budget through shell companies registered to residential addresses in Scranton." Elena did not lean forward. She did not look at the numbers. Her gaze remained fixed on my face, her eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. I turned the page, displaying the public property deeds and the Uniform Commercial Code filings. "He is using that stolen cash to buy abandoned strip malls. Worse, he leveraged the entire Castro Freight rolling stock as collateral for mezzanine loans to cover his down payments. He put liens on our trucks, Mom. If his real estate gamble fails, the shadow lenders will repossess the entire fleet. We will lose everything. The drivers will lose their jobs. Dad will lose his legacy." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the maternal instinct to kick in, for the protective shock to wash over her face as she realized her son was destroying the family empire. I expected denial, followed by panic, followed by a desperate plea to help fix it. Instead, Elena set the silver shears down on the granite. The metal clinked sharply. She picked up a pristine white linen towel and slowly wiped her hands, her posture rigid, her chin tilting upward. "You always want to tear him down," she said. The words struck me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I blinked, confused by the sudden freezing shift in the room. "Mom, the proof is right here," I urged, tapping my index finger against the official county deed documents. "These are his signatures. These are the liens." Elena snatched the cover of the manila folder and flipped it shut, hiding the spreadsheets from view. She refused to even glance at the red ink. "You are paranoid, Melody." She gripped the edge of the granite island, her knuckles turning white. "You have been fiercely jealous of your brother's success since you were children. Now that your father has finally given him the recognition he deserves, you spend your weekend digging through the trash trying to manufacture a scandal to humiliate him." "It is not a manufactured scandal," I protested, my voice rising a fraction of an inch. "It is felony fraud." "He is exploring strategic expansion." Elena snapped, her voice turning venomous. "Derek is taking this company out of the dark ages. He is diversifying our portfolio into commercial real estate. You simply cannot understand his methods because you lack an entrepreneurial mind. You only see pennies. Derek sees empires." I stared at the woman who raised me, feeling a cold, terrifying chasm open between us. She was using corporate buzzwords she did not understand to justify a theft she refused to acknowledge. She was gaslighting me in my own childhood kitchen, choosing a comforting delusion over empirical evidence. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. My father strode into the kitchen wearing a tailored navy suit, loosening his silk tie. He walked straight to the mahogany liquor cabinet and poured a generous measure of scotch over a single cube of ice. "What is all this shouting?" Hector demanded, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Melody is throwing another tantrum," Elena said, picking her shears back up and resuming her work on the hydrangeas. "She is running around making wild accusations about Derek. She claims he is stealing fuel and ruining the company." Hector took a slow sip of his scotch, the ice clinking against the crystal. He turned his heavy gaze toward me, his face wearing an expression of deep, paternal disappointment. "I told you to leave the heavy lifting to your brother," Hector warned, pointing his glass at me. "Derek is making aggressive moves in the Scranton market. Real estate is how generational wealth is secured. You have to spend capital to build capital." "He took out loans against our trucks," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He risked the entire fleet." "That is the cost of doing business," Hector barked, slamming his free hand onto the counter. "You have zero appetite for risk. That is why you are a bookkeeper. You panic at the sight of debt. The sharks at Penn Iron Capital understand risk. Those boys in Philadelphia review our aggregate numbers every month, and they have not raised a single red flag. They know how to spot a winner. They trust Derek. And so do I." The dramatic irony hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My father was using the phantom authority of Penn Iron Capital to justify his son's embezzlement. He was weaponizing my own creation against me, praising a fictitious board of directors while berating the very daughter who owned the controlling shares of his life's work. I looked at my mother, meticulously arranging her white flowers. I looked at my father, sipping his expensive scotch puffed up with unearned pride. The emotional wound did not sting. It simply cauterized. In that pristine, fragrant kitchen, a profound realization washed over me. My parents were not passive victims trapped in the dark by a manipulative son. They were the ones guarding the door to the dark room. They were active, willing accomplices in their own destruction. They would bend reality, ignore mathematics, and sacrifice my sanity just to protect Derek's fragile image. I realized I could not save my parents from themselves. The deep, intrinsic desire to earn their approval, the desperate hope that they would one day see my value, evaporated like mist over a hot engine block. The emotional connection was severed, cut cleaner than the stems of the hydrangeas on the counter. I reached out and pulled the manila folder back across the granite. I tucked it safely under my arm. I can only rely on the cold, hard math. If they wanted to bet their entire family legacy on their golden child, I would step aside and let them roll the dice. But I would not allow them to drag my 51% equity down into the grave with him. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth, any fear, any daughterly affection. "I just crunched the numbers. I will leave the high-level strategy to Derek." I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen, their smug, satisfied silence following me out the front door. They thought they had won the argument. They thought they had put the jealous sister back in her place. They had no idea that their golden boy had already drained the operational accounts dry, and the real-world consequences were waiting to ambush them. The illusion of their prosperity was about to shatter, and it would start the very next morning with a single frozen fuel pump at the Allentown yard. Tuesday morning arrived with the subtle hum of impending disaster. I stood by the frosted glass of my office window, a ceramic mug of black coffee warming my palms, and watched the financial decay bleed from my spreadsheets directly into the physical world. The primary fueling station at the center of the Allentown yard was a chaotic bottleneck of idling Peterbilt rigs. Drivers leaned out of their high cabs, shouting over the deafening roar of diesel engines. The electronic card readers attached to the commercial pumps flashed a synchronized, blinding red light across the pavement. Declined. I stepped out of the office and walked onto the concrete loading dock. The winter air was sharp, carrying the bitter scent of raw exhaust and frozen asphalt. A veteran driver named Marcus slammed the heavy black nozzle back into the metal cradle, his thick shoulders hunched in deep frustration. He kicked the steel base of the pump. His heavy work boots left a dark scuff mark on the yellow paint. I checked my tablet. The notification from our primary diesel supplier sat at the very top of my inbox, stamped with a timestamp from midnight. 60 days of non-payment had finally triggered an automatic account freeze. The vendor was no longer negotiating. They cut the cord. The reality of Derek hauling our cash into Scranton real estate had severed the company life support. Our trucks were grounded. For a freight hauler, an empty fuel tank is a death sentence. The drivers gathered in a tight circle near the dispatch bay, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Panic, raw and visceral, rippled through the group. These men and women were paid by the mile. If the wheels did not turn, their children did not eat. The terrified murmur of unpaid mortgages and missed car payments buzzed through the crowd like a hornet nest kicked by a careless boot. The heavy steel door of the executive suite swung open. Derek strode out onto the concrete, flanked by our father. My brother wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked absurdly out of place against the gritty backdrop of grease-stained concrete and rusted shipping containers. He raised his hands, flashing that brilliant, empty smile, attempting to calm the rising tide of blue-collar anxiety. "Listen up, everyone!" Derek projected his voice, bouncing off the corrugated metal siding. "We have a slight technical hurdle this morning. Nothing to worry about." Marcus crossed his arms, staring a hole straight through my brother's designer tie. "The pumps are locked out, Derek. My rig is supposed to be on the turnpike an hour ago. I have a load of perishable medical supplies rotting in the trailer." Derek waved a manicured hand, brushing away the crisis like a pesky fly. "It is just a clerical error on the supplier's end. We are experiencing some unforeseen market fluctuations regarding the new spot contracts. The banking algorithms flagged a routing discrepancy. It will be sorted by lunchtime." I watched the dispatchers exchange dark, knowing glances. Vince chewed on a wooden toothpick, shaking his head. These workers did not understand the intricate mechanics of shell companies or mezzanine debt, but they possessed a built-in radar for nonsense. They recognized corporate doublespeak, and they knew Derek was lying through his teeth. Yet they were trapped. They could only grumble, kick the tires, and wait for the golden boy to produce a miracle. The charade on the dock lasted 10 minutes before the facade cracked. The moment Derek and Hector stepped back inside the building, the practiced smiles vanished. My father marched straight down the narrow hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing like a drumbeat. He shoved my office door open without knocking. Derek trailed a few steps behind, looking pale, and suddenly very small without an audience to enchant. Hector kicked the door shut. The latch clicked, sealing the three of us in the cramped, fluorescent-lit room. "Fix it," Hector ordered, pointing a trembling finger at my desk. I remained seated, keeping my posture relaxed, my hands folded over a stack of manifest logs. "Fix what, Dad?" "The unforeseen market fluctuations." Hector slammed his fist onto the edge of my desk. A plastic pen rolled off the edge and clattered onto the linoleum. "Do not get smart with me, Melody. The fuel vendor is holding a grudge over a delayed wire transfer. We have a temporary liquidity gap. I need cash in the operating account right now, or we start bleeding penalty fees on 30 different delivery contracts." I looked at Derek. He refused to meet my gaze, studying the scuff marks on his expensive leather shoes. The liquidity gap was currently buying a vacant strip mall in Lackawanna County, but bringing that up would only trigger another barrage of intense gaslighting. "I am just the bookkeeper," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "You told me to leave the high-level strategy to the chief executive officer." Hector leaned over the desk, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Desperation stripped away his polished exterior, revealing the terrified old man underneath. I am telling you to use your network, he hissed. You spent years auditing elite healthcare firms. You know commercial lenders. You know the underwriters who write short-term paper. Call them. Secure a high-interest bridge loan to cover the diesel until the new regional contract pays out. He was asking me to leverage my professional reputation to secure predatory debt, simply to buy Derek another month of playtime. It was highly offensive, crossing every ethical boundary I held. My father was demanding I light my own career on fire to keep his son warm. The impulse to refuse tasted metallic and sharp on my tongue. I wanted to hand them the forensic audit, walk out the door, and let the repo trucks dismantle their empire piece by piece. But revealing my hand now, while Derek still held signing authority over the remaining assets, was a severe tactical error. If I fought them, Hector would fire me, lock me out of the server, and blindfold my holding company until the bankruptcy courts took over. I needed to neutralize their panic. I needed them complacent and entirely convinced they held the high ground. I looked at my father's red, sweating face. I looked at my brother's cowardly posture. I let my shoulders slump, orchestrating a picture of total defeat. You are right, I whispered, staring down at my desk. I will make the call. Hector exhaled a long, ragged breath, his posture instantly straightening. That is what family does, Melody. We pitch in. I picked up the desk phone. I did not dial a commercial lender in Philadelphia. I dialed the automated customer service line from my personal cellular provider. I pressed the receiver to my ear, listening to the robotic voice list menu options, and began the performance of my life. Richard, it is Melody Castro, I said, projecting a tone of urgent professionalism. I need a favor. Yes, Castro Freight. We hit a snag with a vendor dispute and need a short-term bridge to clear the yard. I paused, pretending to listen to the automated voice drone on about billing cycles. I nodded, furrowing my brow to sell the illusion. I know the rates are steep this quarter, I continued, glancing up at Derek. Let us do 12% annualized 30-day term, $500,000 liquid. Can you wire it directly to the primary operating account by noon? I waited another beat, pressing my lips together in mock concentration. Thank you, Richard. Email over the digital signature forms. I owe you a steak dinner. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle. The plastic click sounded like a gavel falling. The funds will clear by noon, I said quietly. The trucks will roll. The transformation in the room was instantaneous. The fear drained from Derek's face, replaced immediately by that sickening, unearned smirk. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffing out as if he had just negotiated the complex deal himself. See, Derek said, clapping our father on the back. Just a tiny bump in the road. I knew you could handle the administrative cleanup, Mel. Good work. Hector adjusted his cuffs, his dominant swagger fully restored. He looked down at me, not with gratitude, but with the smug satisfaction of a dictator who had just successfully crushed a rebellion. You see what happens when you stop fighting your brother and start acting like a team player? He lectured. Keep your head down, do the paperwork, and let us handle the business. They turned and walked out of my office, their laughter echoing down the hallway as they discussed where to grab lunch. They were painfully arrogant, thoroughly convinced they had bullied the quiet sister into covering their fraudulent tracks. They believed they had won the war. I sat in the quiet office staring at the silent phone. My strict ethical boundaries remained perfectly intact. No loan was coming. No underwriter was wiring funds. I had just purchased a few days of blind complacency. I let them puff out their chests and march back out onto the warehouse floor, unwittingly setting the stage for their own catastrophic ruin. The red herring had worked. The predators thought they had cornered the prey, oblivious to the fact that the cage they were standing in was already locked. I just had to wait for them to make their next fatal mistake, which Derek would eagerly deliver to my desk before the week was over. Thursday morning arrived, and the Allentown freight yard settled into an uneasy, fragile rhythm. The drivers kept their heads down, hauling heavy pallets and ignoring the creeping dread that hung thick in the cold October air. Upstairs in the plush corner suite overlooking the diesel pumps, my brother was growing anxious. My fabricated phone call had purchased him a brief window of relief, but a parasite always senses when the host begins to reject it. Derek knew I held the administrative passwords to the raw data servers. He understood I possessed the analytical capability to track his phantom consulting firms. He realized his secret Scranton real estate syndicate remained terribly vulnerable as long as I occupied the back office. He needed to remove the surgeon before she could excise the tumor. At 10 o'clock sharp, my office door swung open. Derek stepped inside, bringing the sharp scent of imported cologne and unspoken panic into my cramped workspace. He did not bother to knock. He wore a pristine navy pinstripe suit, his tie knotted in a perfect Windsor, projecting the polished image of a seasoned executive. His eyes, however, darted nervously toward my dual monitors, betraying a frantic energy he could not hide. He carried a thick, stark white folder tucked tightly under his arm. "Melody, we need to have a quick sync," he said, using the empty corporate jargon he favored when trying to sound authoritative. I pushed my keyboard away and folded my hands neatly on the desk. "A quick sync? That is a new one, Derek. What is on the agenda today?" He pulled up a folding chair sitting across from me. He placed the white folder flat on my desk, keeping his manicured fingers resting over the top edge. He offered a tight, practiced smile. "The executive board has been reviewing our long-term operational efficiency." Derek began clearing his throat. "As we transition into a modern logistics powerhouse, we must streamline our internal processes. Keeping family members in the financial auditing seat creates a dangerous conflict of interest. It holds the company back from evolving." I stared at him, letting his hollow words echo in the small room. The executive board he referenced consisted entirely of our father, our mother, and himself. They were not a board. They were a dysfunctional echo chamber. Hector and I had a long strategic discussion last night. Derek continued gaining a fraction of confidence from my silence. "We decided it is time to bring in a neutral third-party accounting firm, a reputable agency from Philadelphia to handle the books. We want to modernize the infrastructure." He was weaponizing our father's own outdated philosophy against me. Hector always believed that family businesses failed because they lacked ruthless, objective oversight. Derek was twisting that genuine belief to blind our father, convincing the old man that firing his own daughter was a hallmark of sophisticated corporate growth. "Dad agreed to this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Derek nodded, his smirk returning. "He signed off on it this morning. Elena agrees as well. Mom thinks the stress of this job is taking a toll on your mental health. She wants you to take some time off. Travel. Find a hobby." The audacity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. They were framing my termination as a benevolent act of familial care. They were wrapping an execution in a warm blanket of fake concern. Derek pushed the white folder across the desk until it bumped against my coffee mug. "This is your transition package," he said smoothly. "It is a very generous severance agreement. We are offering you 6 months of full salary and continued healthcare coverage. Consider it a thank you for your years of service in the back office. We just need your signature to process the outbound transition." He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He thought he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his embezzlement scheme. By pushing me out the door with a handful of cash, he assumed I would quietly fade into the background, leaving him free to drain the company dry. I looked at the white folder, then back up to his arrogant face. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a tantrum or demand to speak to our father. I knew Hector would simply parrot Derek's talking points, praising the boy for making a tough executive choice. "I will review the terms," I said quietly. Derek stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Excellent. Have it signed and on my desk by tomorrow afternoon. We want to finalize the restructuring before the weekend." He walked out of the office, pulling the door shut behind him. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, light and triumphant. The air in my office felt sterile and heavy. I picked up the white folder. The paper was thick, expensive, and heavy with legal intent. I flipped open the cover. The document was 40 pages long, filled with dense, suffocating paragraphs of standard employment termination clauses. To an untrained eye, it looked like a standard corporate severance package. But I was not untrained. Before I returned to Castro Freight, I spent years working as a forensic auditor, specializing in regional healthcare mergers. My job was to dissect thousands of pages of hospital acquisition contracts, hunting for hidden liabilities and buried debts. I learned a crucial lesson during those grueling, sleepless nights in Philadelphia. Criminals do not hide their crimes in bold text or flashy headlines. They hide their sins deep inside paragraph indentations on page 12. I picked up a red pen and began to read. I skipped the generic confidentiality clauses and the non-disparagement agreements. Those were standard mechanisms designed to buy my silence. I skimmed past the payout schedules and the medical insurance extensions. I was hunting for the anomaly. I was looking for the specific clause Derek instructed his shadow lawyers to insert. I found it buried deep on page 12, disguised under a misleading subheading titled General Release of Ongoing Operational Claims. I traced the tip of my red pen under the dense legal text. The employee hereby agrees to hold harmless the chief executive officer, the managing directors, and all affiliated entities from any and all claims regarding fiduciary misconduct, operational negligence, or financial mismanagement. Furthermore, the employee permanently waives and surrenders any undocumented, assumed, or verbal claims to company equity assets or rolling stock. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. This was not a severance agreement. It was a liability waiver. It was a blanket immunity clause. It was a true Chekhov's gun loaded and pointed directly at my head. Derek was terrified. He knew the money was missing. He knew his Scranton real estate gambit was built on a fragile house of cards, and he knew I possessed the skills to knock it down. He was desperately trying to legally immunize himself before the inevitable audit hit the fan. If I signed this document, I would retroactively absolve him of all embezzlement charges. Worse, I would legally surrender my 51% ownership stake, reclassifying my holding company as an undocumented claim. He was trying to trick the majority shareholder into signing away her own empire for 6 months of severance pay. I sat back in my chair, staring at the red ink bleeding into the heavy paper. The calculated nature of the document was staggering. My brother was not just a reckless spender. He was a premeditated predator, attempting to use contract law to steal my life savings. I did not rip the document into pieces. I did not march upstairs and throw it in his face. A master chess player never interrupts her opponent when he is busy making a fatal mistake. By handing me this specific liability waiver, Derek had just handed me written, undeniable proof of his intent to defraud the company's stakeholders. He provided the exact legal ammunition I needed to prove he was operating with dark foresight. I folded the severance agreement carefully and slipped it into my leather briefcase. I ignored his email requesting a status update on the signature. I would keep the printed document safe, setting the perfect legal trap for the final, devastating act of retaliation. Derek believed he had tied up his loose ends. He thought the back office bookkeeper was packing her bags and walking away in defeat. He was entirely wrong. I stood up from my desk and began opening the heavy metal filing cabinets lining the back wall of my office. If Derek was careless enough to leave a trail of breadcrumbs in a severance agreement, he was bound to have made mistakes elsewhere. I needed to gather every single piece of paper connecting his signature to the company debts before I initiated the final strike. I pulled open the drawer labeled Mezzanine Debt and Commercial Leases. The metal tracks groaned under the weight of the thick, dust-covered files. I reached inside, intending to pull the standard truck financing contracts. Instead, I found something that made the blood freeze in my veins. I realized my brother had not just stolen cash from our family. He had crossed a profound, terrifying legal threshold, dragging our aging father directly into the crosshairs of federal prosecutors. The air inside my ground floor office tasted of stale coffee and impending ruin. I pulled a corrugated cardboard banker's box from the supply closet, tossing a few generic notepads and highlighters inside to maintain the illusion that I was complying with the severance agreement. My actual focus remained locked on the bottom drawer of the heavy steel filing cabinet. The metal tracks groaned in protest as I yanked it open, revealing the thick, dust-covered folders housing our equipment leases and mezzanine debt contracts. If Derek was bold enough to slide a liability waiver onto my desk, he had to be hiding something monumental in the original loan applications. I began pulling the thick manila folders, spreading the paperwork across my desk. I bypassed the standard commercial agreements and zeroed in on the shadow lenders, the predatory firms operating out of strip malls in Delaware and New Jersey. I opened a file labeled Horizon Capital Funding. It contained the origination documents for a high-yield loan secured against 12 of our newest Peterbilt tractors. I flipped past the amortization schedules and the penalty clauses, hunting for the signature block. When I found the final authorization page, the blood drained from my face, leaving a cold, prickling sensation spreading down my neck. There, resting on the bottom line, was my father's signature. Hector Castro always signed his name with a rigid, unbroken scrawl, a heavy-handed mark honed by 3 decades of authorizing bills of lading on busy loading docks. He pressed the pen down so hard, it usually left a tactile groove in the paper. The signature staring up at me was wrong. The loops were too careful. The ink pooled slightly at the top of the capital letter H, betraying a microscopic hesitation. The slant of the C leaned just a fraction of an inch too far to the right. It was a tracing. It was a calculated, deliberate forgery executed by a hand trying desperately to mimic strength. I pulled 3 more shadow loans from the cabinet. Every single one bore the same counterfeit scrawl. Derek had not just borrowed against the trucks. He lacked the executive authority to pledge the rolling stock as collateral, so he simply stole our father's identity to push the paperwork through. The stakes instantly shifted from a civil dispute into a profound criminal nightmare. These predatory lenders were incorporated across state lines. By transmitting forged financial documents electronically to secure funds from Delaware, Derek had triggered federal jurisdiction. This was no longer just corporate embezzlement. It was federal wire fraud. If these shadow loans defaulted, the lenders would not just send repo trucks. They would send lawyers, and those lawyers would alert the authorities. Because Hector was listed as the primary guarantor, he would be the one facing the grand jury. Derek had built a multi-million-dollar real estate gamble in Scranton and used his own aging father as a human shield against federal prison. I traced my finger over the counterfeit ink, feeling a sickening wave of revulsion. Derek was willing to sacrifice the man who worshipped him just to cover a bad bet. Before I could process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the intercom on my desk buzzed a harsh, grating tone. Melody, the receptionist, crackled through the speaker. "Your father wants you upstairs in the executive conference room. Right now." Mandatory family meeting. I closed the Horizon Capital folder, slipping it seamlessly into my leather briefcase, alongside the forensic audit and the severance waiver. I snapped the brass locks shut. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my charcoal trousers, and walked out of the office. The executive suite felt different today. The usual swagger was missing, replaced by a suffocating, frantic energy. Hector stood behind the sprawling oak table. His tie loosened, his face flushed a dangerous blotchy red. Elena sat in a leather corner chair, twisting a gold ring around her finger with rapid, nervous movements. Derek paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, refusing to make eye contact as I walked through the heavy glass doors. "Have a seat," Hector ordered, dispensing with any semblance of a greeting. I remained standing, gripping the handle of my briefcase. "What is this about, Dad?" He slid a thick stack of crisp, legal-sized documents across the polished oak. "This is a commercial consolidation loan," he declared, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "The vendors are getting restless. We need to restructure our debt profile to ensure smooth operations for the next 2 quarters. We are rolling the short-term liabilities into a single, manageable monthly payment." I looked down at the paperwork. The requested principal was staggering. It was enough to cover the missing fuel money, pay off the shadow lenders, and likely leave a healthy surplus for Derek to funnel straight back into his failing properties. "There is a slight hurdle with the underwriting," Hector continued, avoiding my gaze. "The bank requires a secondary guarantor with a pristine debt-to-income ratio to finalize the Tier 1 interest rate. Your brother is over-leveraged with his personal investments, and your mother and I have our assets tied up in the family trust." He tapped a thick finger against the signature line. "You have excellent credit, Melody. No debt, clean history. I need you to co-sign this loan." The audacity of the request echoed in the quiet room. My father was demanding I pledge my personal financial future, my pristine credit score, and all my private assets to secure a loan designed to cover my brother's felony embezzlement. I looked at Elena. She stopped twisting her ring and offered a tight, expectant smile, waiting for me to fall into line. I looked at Derek, who stared out the window at the distant highway, pretending he was merely a spectator to this ambush. I pushed the documents back across the oak table. The paper slid with a soft, dismissive hiss. "I will not sign that," I said, keeping my voice level and cold. Hector blinked, his jaw dropping a fraction of an inch. "What did you say?" I said, "No," I repeated, meeting his furious gaze. "I am not co-signing a consolidation loan to cover unexplainable holes in the ledger. There are hundreds of thousands of dollars missing from the operating accounts, Dad. The math does not justify taking on more debt. If you want to restructure, you need to demand an accounting of where the cash went first." Derek spun around from the window, his face pale. "She does not know what she is talking about," he stammered, stepping toward the table. "The accounts are perfectly balanced. She is just trying to sabotage the deal because she is bitter about the restructuring." "Shut up, Derek," I snapped, the authority in my voice, freezing him mid-step. Hector slammed both hands down on the oak table. The loud crack made Elena jump in her leather chair. "You do not speak to the chief executive officer that way," Hector roared, his chest heaving. "And you do not turn your back on this family when we ask you to pitch in. We put a roof over your head. We paid for your existence. You owe us your loyalty." "Loyalty is a two-way street," I replied, my grip tightening on my briefcase. "You are asking me to blindfold myself and step in front of a financial train." "You have no stake in this business," Hector yelled, his face inching closer to mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and raw fear. "You own nothing here. You are a glorified calculator. We are offering you a chance to finally contribute something meaningful to the Castro legacy, and you are acting like a selfish, ungrateful child." He snatched a pen from the holder and threw it onto the documents. "I am giving you an ultimatum, Melody. You have until Friday morning to sign these papers and guarantee this loan. If you refuse, you pack your desk and you leave this yard. You will not be welcome in this office. You will not be welcome at Sunday dinner. You will be dead to this family." The silence that followed his decree was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning vent. I stood in the center of the room, letting the crushing weight of his ultimatum wash over me. He had just declared my worth was entirely contingent on my willingness to be a sacrificial lamb. He was choosing the son who forged his signature and risked his freedom over the daughter who simply refused to lie for them. I absorbed the emotional blow without shedding a single tear. The deep, lingering ache of parental rejection that had haunted my entire adult life simply evaporated, replaced by a chilling, liberating clarity. The last thread of guilt tying me to their sinking ship snapped. I looked at my mother, who had turned her face away, choosing cowardice over intervention. I looked at my brother, who wore a faint, pathetic smirk of victory. Finally, I looked at my father, staring into the eyes of a man who truly believed he had broken my spirit. "I understand the terms perfectly," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass doors, leaving the unsigned documents sitting on the table. As the elevator doors closed, shielding me from their view, I let out a long, slow breath. They were thoroughly convinced they had removed the last obstacle to their unchecked control. They thought they had bullied me into submission. They had no idea that by disowning me, they had just handed me the moral absolute necessary to burn their entire delusional world to the ground. The hesitation was gone. The shadow owner was ready to step into the light. I woke up the next morning long before the sun crested the Appalachian Ridge. The hardwood floor of my apartment felt like ice against my bare feet. I walked into the kitchen, the silence of the early hour pressing heavily against my ears, and started a pot of black coffee. Outside my window, the Pennsylvania sky was a bruised, dark purple, promising a bitter frost. The trauma of being formally disowned carries a unique, suffocating weight. My father had drawn a line in the sand, demanding I pledge my personal financial ruin to save his golden boy. He looked me in the eye and told me I owed them for my very existence. The psychological conditioning of a lifetime spent seeking their approval roared in the back of my mind, urging me to surrender. I stood by the kitchen counter, wrapping my cold hands around the ceramic mug, and allowed myself to seriously consider the path of least resistance. I could just walk away. I could sign the severance agreement, take the 6 months of transition pay, and disappear. I could pack my belongings, move across the country, and resume my quiet career in corporate healthcare auditing. I could leave Castro Freight to its inevitable, disastrous fate. When the shadow lenders realized the real estate investments had cratered, they would execute the liens. The tow trucks would swarm the Allentown yard. The federal investigators would trace the forged signatures directly to Derek. And Hector would be forced to watch his beloved son face a grand jury. Letting them crash and burn under the weight of their own incompetence felt like poetic justice. They had chosen their champion. They deserved to reap the harvest he had planted. I finished my coffee in the dark, my resolve wavering. I put on my heavy wool coat and drove toward the industrial district, the heater in my sedan fighting a losing battle against the October chill. When I pulled through the chain-link gates of the freight yard, the morning shift was already in full swing. The harsh halogen floodlights illuminated the loading docks, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked concrete. The familiar rhythmic clatter of pallet jacks and the deep rumble of diesel engines washed over me. I watched the yard workers moving with practiced efficiency. These were gritty, resilient people who worked 60-hour weeks to keep their families fed. I parked my car and walked toward the main administrative building. The freezing air stung my cheeks. As I approached the dispatch bay, the heavy steel door flew open. Derek marched out onto the concrete dock. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, a silk scarf wrapped neatly around his neck, looking like a sovereign surveying his unwashed subjects. He carried a clipboard in his leather-gloved hand. Following closely behind him was Hank, one of our most dependable veteran drivers. Hank had hauled freight for our family for 2 decades. His face was weathered from years staring down sun-baked highways, and his hands were stained with perpetual grease. Hank looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, and he held a thermos of coffee like a lifeline. "You missed the departure window by 20 minutes!" Derek barked, his voice echoing loudly over the ambient noise of the yard. Hank stopped walking, turning to face my brother. "I drove through the night to make up for the pump lockouts yesterday, Derek. The fueling delay put me behind the mandatory rest hour regulations. I had to pull over and sleep or risk a union violation. I still delivered the payload before the client opened their receiving doors." "I do not care about your rest hour excuses," Derek snapped, stepping closer, using his height to intimidate the older man. "The manifest dictates a precise departure time. When you decide to take a nap on the shoulder of the turnpike, you make this entire operation look amateurish. We run a tight ship here. If you cannot handle the scheduling rigors of a modern logistics firm, there is a stack of applications on my desk from younger drivers hungry for your route." The sheer hypocrisy was nauseating. The delay was a direct result of Derek draining the operational accounts to fund his phantom real estate shell companies, which caused the fuel supplier to freeze our pumps. Hank had broken his back trying to salvage a disaster he did not create. Now, he was being publicly humiliated for it. Several other drivers and loading dock workers stopped what they were doing. The clatter of the yard faded into a tense, uncomfortable hush. They watched their respected colleague absorb the verbal abuse from a man who had never driven a rig a single mile in his life. Hank lowered his gaze, swallowing his pride. "I need this route, sir. It will not happen again." I could not stand in the shadows any longer. I stepped out from behind a stack of wooden shipping pallets and walked directly onto the loading dock, placing myself between my brother and the exhausted driver. "That is enough, Derek," I said, keeping my tone even but firm. "Hank mitigated a disaster yesterday. The routing delay was a direct consequence of the vendor freeze, which fell strictly under executive management. You are reprimanding the wrong person." "Go grab a fresh coffee, Hank." Hank offered a brief, grateful nod and hurried away toward the break room, eager to escape the firing line. Derek whipped around to face me, his eyes flashing with a sudden, unhinged fury. His pristine facade cracked, revealing the frantic, cornered predator underneath. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed, his voice carrying across a silent loading dock. "I am the financial auditor," I replied calmly. "And I am telling you the timeline failure belongs to the front office, not the drivers." Derek let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You are nothing. You are a glorified secretary clinging to a desk. I am the chief executive officer of this company." He stepped toward me, pointing a gloved finger inches from my face, ensuring every worker on the dock could hear his next words. "Stay out of this, Melody. You are just a bookkeeper. You build nothing. You sit in your little office pushing pennies around while I build an empire. "You do not belong out here." The words were designed to shrink me, to put the quiet, obedient sister back in her designated box. He expected me to drop my gaze, apologize for overstepping, and scurry back to my spreadsheets. Instead, a profound, deafening silence settled in my mind. The freezing wind whipping across the concrete loading dock faded away. The rumble of the idling Peterbilt engines vanished. For 30 seconds, the world around me ceased to exist, replaced by a vivid, searing memory from 7 years ago. I was 25 years old again, sitting in a sterile, mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Philadelphia. The air smelled of expensive leather and lemon furniture polish. A stoic corporate attorney sat across from me, sliding a thick stack of incorporation documents across the table. My father was lying in the cardiac intensive care unit at Lehigh Valley Hospital, his skin a terrifying shade of gray, hooked to a chorus of beeping monitors. The stress of impending bankruptcy had nearly stopped his heart. He was hours away from losing the freight yard, his legacy, and his pride. I picked up a heavy fountain pen. My hand shook as I signed my name over and over again. With those strokes of ink, I liquidated my entire retirement account. I drained the savings I had scraped together working brutal 80-hour weeks at the healthcare firm. I emptied my checking account. I traded every single dollar to my name to purchase the crushing debts of Castro Freight, breathing life into a newly minted holding company called Penn Iron Capital. I bought my father's life back. I saved the family legacy. I secured the jobs of every single worker standing in the yard, and I did it in total secrecy, accepting a lifetime of back-office shadows just to protect the fragile ego of the man recovering in that hospital bed. The memory snapped shut. The bitter October wind rushed back against my face. I looked at Derek, standing in his custom-tailored coat, his chest puffed out with unearned arrogance. He felt entitled to verbally abuse the backbone of this company. He felt entitled to forge our father's signature. He felt entitled to gamble away the livelihoods of 80 working-class families to fund his pathetic country club delusions. The trauma of being disowned by my parents evaporated, burned away by a cold, calculating clarity. The lingering hesitation, the quiet voice urging me to walk away and let the chips fall where they may, went entirely silent. I was not a victim. I was the majority shareholder of a multi-million-dollar logistics firm. These were my trucks. This was my loading dock. These were my employees. I would not allow a parasitic fraud to destroy the working-class families who relied on this yard. I owed my parents nothing, but I had a ruthless, unshakable obligation to protect my asset and the people who actually kept the wheels turning. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl an insult back at my brother. I simply looked at him with an expression of profound, surgical detachment. "You are right, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the freezing air like a scalpel. "I am just a bookkeeper." I turned my back on him and walked straight to my office. I locked the door behind me. I did not take off my coat. I pulled my leather briefcase onto the desk and snapped the brass locks open. I verified the contents. The red herring severance agreement containing the liability waiver. The comprehensive forensic audit detailing the phantom shell companies. The forged mezzanine debt origination papers. The detonator was fully assembled. I picked up the desk phone, my fingers flying across the keypad, ready to execute a financial massacre they would never see coming. I turned the deadbolt on my office door. The heavy brass cylinder slid into the frame with a satisfying, final click. I reached up and lowered the vinyl blinds, plunging the small workspace into a cool, muted gray. Outside, the diesel engines continued their endless grinding chorus, rattling the thin glass panes. But inside the room, a profound stillness took over. I walked to my desk, bypassing the rolling chair, and stood over the leather briefcase resting on the blotter. The transformation was physical, a shedding of old skin. For 32 years, my shoulders had carried the invisible, suffocating weight of seeking my parents' approval. I had twisted myself into a quiet, compliant shape, hoping that if I just worked hard enough, stayed in the background long enough, they would finally see my value. I had accepted the crumbs they threw my way, rationalizing their neglect as tough love. That girl died on the loading dock 10 minutes ago. I reached for the desk phone and dialed a private unlisted number. It bypassed the standard reception desk of a high-rise legal firm in downtown Philadelphia and rang directly into the personal office of my managing attorney. Donovan speaking, the crisp baritone voice, answered on the second ring. "Donovan, it is Melody Castro," I said. My voice sounded different, stripped of any familial hesitation, vibrating with a cold, metallic edge. "Melody," he replied, a note of genuine surprise piercing his professional tone. "It has been quiet on your end for a long time. Is the proxy arrangement still holding up?" "The proxy is terminated," I stated, staring down at the thick stack of financial documents spread across my desk. "Effective immediately, I am activating the shadow clauses." A brief silence followed. Donovan was a veteran corporate litigator, a man who charged a premium to navigate the cutthroat realities of Pennsylvania business law. He knew the genesis of Penn Iron Capital better than anyone. He was the one who drew up the original incorporation papers 7 years ago when I sat in his office and handed over my life savings to rescue a father who never thanked me. "Understood," Donovan said, his tone shifting instantly into a sharp, clinical gear. "Are we simply unmasking the 51% equity, or are we preparing for a hostile board realignment?" "We are preparing for an execution," I replied. I outlined the strict parameters of the strike. I instructed Donovan to draft the formal revocation of Hector Castro's voting proxy. For 7 years, my father had operated under the delusion that an anonymous board of directors was rubber-stamping his decisions, praising his every move from a distant ivory tower. By tomorrow morning, that grand illusion would evaporate. I was stripping away his executive authority, reducing him from a self-proclaimed titan of industry to a minority shareholder with zero operational control. The power he wielded like a club was about to turn to dust in his hands. Next, I detailed the impending commercial consolidation loan. My father and brother were scheduled to sign the final paperwork at a downtown Allentown bank on Friday morning. "I need an immediate injunction filed to block that capital restructuring," I instructed, pacing the narrow length of my office. "They are attempting to secure a multi-million-dollar bridge loan using the company rolling stock as collateral." Donovan typed rapidly, the rapid clatter of his mechanical keyboard echoing through the receiver. "If you hold the majority stake, they cannot legally encumber the assets without your direct signature. The underwriting bank will reject the application the moment we update the corporate registry. They intend to push it through using fraudulent authorizations," I explained, pulling the Horizon Capital folder toward me. "My brother has been forging the primary guarantor signatures on mezzanine debt for the past 8 months. He is heavily overleveraged in commercial real estate, and he is using our freight yard as his personal casino." The typing stopped abruptly. "Federal wire fraud." Donovan murmured, the gravity of the situation settling over the line. "Melody, if they cross state lines with counterfeit signatures, the authorities will dismantle the entire operation. You need to insulate the holding company immediately." "That is exactly what we are doing," I said. "I will handle the bank meeting in person. I need you to overwrite the certified incorporation documents, the updated capitalization table, and the proxy revocation forms directly to my home address. I want the hard copies in my hands by Thursday evening." "Consider it done," Donovan replied. I will have a courier on the turnpike within the hour. The paperwork will be ironclad. Good luck, Melody. I hung up the phone. The logistical machinery was in motion. The legal trap was set, its steel jaws pulled wide open. Now I needed to assemble the ammunition. I opened the empty cardboard banker's box I had grabbed earlier and shoved it off the desk. It hit the linoleum floor with a hollow thud. I would not be packing up my belongings. Instead, I pulled a sleek black leather portfolio from the bottom drawer. This would serve as the master dossier, the physical manifestation of my authority. I started with the Genesis documents. I slid in the original bank transfers from 7 years ago, the cleared checks and wire receipts proving that my personal funds had rescued the company from the brink of insolvency. It was the undeniable proof that Castro Freight survived solely because of the daughter they treated like a disposable servant. The numbers told a story of sacrifice that my parents had conveniently written out of their history. Next, I compiled the embezzlement proof. I printed pristine, high-resolution copies of the phantom fuel authorizations, placing them side by side with the GPS satellite logs. The contrast was stark. The data proved the trucks were parked in a dirt lot in Scranton, while the company credit cards were drained at truck stops in Syracuse. I added the public property deeds, highlighting Derek's name on the limited liability companies that owned the failing strip malls. I included photographs from the property listings showing caved-in roofs, shattered neon signs, and weed-choked parking lots. This was the empire my brother was building. A kingdom of rot, financed by stolen diesel fuel. Then came the kill shot. I gently placed the forged mezzanine debt contracts into the portfolio. The counterfeit signatures stared back at me, a desperate, pathetic attempt to mimic our father's heavy, commanding hand. I included the routing numbers proving the illicit funds were wired across state lines from predatory lenders in Delaware, elevating the petty theft to a federal offense. Finally, I added the liability waiver Derek had so arrogantly placed on my desk just 24 hours prior. The severance agreement, designed to buy my silence and legally immunize him from prosecution. It was the ultimate testament to his premeditated guilt. He knew he was committing a crime, and he tried to use my own professional severance as a shield. I closed the black portfolio and zipped it shut. The heavy brass zipper glided smoothly. The leather felt cool and substantial in my hands. This was no longer a disorganized pile of receipts and suspicions. It was a weapon of mass financial destruction, calibrated to strike with pinpoint accuracy. I sat back in my chair, staring at the closed blinds. The tension in my chest was stifling a tight, coiled spring ready to snap. The hardest part of any tactical ambush is the waiting. I had to endure the next 48 hours pretending to be the defeated, broken sister. I had to walk the halls, keep my head down, and let them gloat. I had to swallow their condescending remarks and endure their smug glances without revealing the ace hidden in my sleeve. Out on the loading dock, the shift change whistle blew a sharp, piercing wail that cut through the afternoon air. The midday sun struggled to pierce the thick, gray Pennsylvania cloud cover, casting a flat, unforgiving light over the industrial park. My parents and my brother were likely sitting in a comfortable, upscale restaurant across town right now, clinking crystal glasses, celebrating their perceived victory over plates of expensive seafood. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had forced the quiet bookkeeper to choose between her family and her career, fully expecting me to fold under the pressure of their ultimatum. They were blindly marching toward their own financial execution, arrogant in their belief that they had already won the war. I unlocked my office door and stepped back out into the hallway. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, damp concrete, and old coffee. I walked past the dispatch bay, offering a polite, subdued nod to the logistics crew. I kept my face an unreadable mask, channeling every ounce of discipline I possessed. Let them enjoy their final 2 days of unearned royalty. Let them polish their imported shoes, practice their hollow executive speeches, and bask in the glow of a false triumph. When Friday morning arrived, they would walk into that executive conference room expecting a coronation. They would bring their expensive pens and their tailored suits, ready to sign away the future of this company, believing the world bowed to their grand illusions. They had no idea the banker was already waiting for the true owner to arrive. Friday morning blanketed Allentown in a crisp, unforgiving frost. The industrial skyline stood sharp against a pale, cloudless horizon. I drove downtown, leaving the diesel fumes and the grinding gears of the freight yard behind, navigating toward the financial district. Sitting on the passenger seat of my sedan was the black leather portfolio. It felt heavier today. The overnight courier from Philadelphia had arrived precisely at 8 o'clock the previous evening, delivering the certified corporate registry updates, the freshly stamped proxy revocation forms, and the ironclad injunctions Donovan had drafted. The shadow ownership was now a matter of indisputable public record. I parked in the subterranean garage beneath First Keystone Commercial Bank. The transition from our gritty blue-collar reality to this cathedral of high finance always carried a distinct sensory shift. The air down here smelled of imported floor wax and filtered ventilation. I rode the polished steel elevator to the 12th floor, the executive lending tier. When the doors parted, I did not step out immediately. I stood in the quiet alcove, observing the reception area through the ornate glass partitions. My family had already arrived. They stood near a sprawling marble receptionist desk, projecting a sickening, unearned confidence. Hector wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair swept back, his posture rigid and domineering. He was speaking loudly to a junior loan officer, gesturing with a heavy gold pen, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice echoing in the vaulted space. Elena stood beside him, draped in a tailored camel hair coat, a string of pearls catching the recessed lighting. She offered the bank staff tight, patronizing smiles, playing the role of the wealthy matriarch to perfection. Derek paced a few feet away, a modern prince waiting for his crown. He checked a heavy platinum watch, adjusting the French cuffs of his crisp white shirt. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. They were treating the bank not as an institution they were begging for a lifeline, but as a kingdom they had already conquered. They believed the consolidation loan was a mere formality, a victory lap marking their total dominion over Castro Freight. I stepped out of the alcove, my heels clicking softly against the terrazzo floor. I wore a simple dark gray tailored sheath dress. No pearls, no flashy watch, no armor other than the black portfolio gripped in my right hand. A young administrative assistant guided them toward the primary executive conference room down the main hall. I hung back, letting a comfortable distance stretch between us, watching them file into the glass-walled enclosure. The room was designed to intimidate, featuring a long, polished mahogany table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. I reached the threshold just as the heavy glass door began to swing shut. I caught the stainless steel handle and pushed it wide open. The subtle shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was instantaneous. Derek looked up from his stack of fraudulent loan applications. His triumphant smirk vanished, replaced immediately by a dark, twisting sneer. He dropped his gold pen onto the mahogany surface and marched toward the door, intercepting me before I could take a full step inside. "What are you doing here, Melody?" he whispered, his voice vibrating with a toxic, condescending edge. He stood close, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me, a tactic he had relied on since we were children. "I am attending the signing," I replied, my tone flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. Derek let out a short, mocking breath, shaking his head. "You have no legal right to be in this room. Dad gave you a choice, and you made it. You are not a guarantor. You are not an executive. You are an unemployed bookkeeper crashing a closed-door financial proceeding. You are only embarrassing yourself." I did not blink. I did not step backward. I just stared at the knot of his silk tie. Before Derek could issue another hollow threat, Elena hurried over the sharp clatter of her designer heels echoing against the glass walls. She inserted herself directly into my path, physically blocking my route to the long wooden table. Her perfume, an overpowering blend of jasmine and synthetic vanilla, hung heavy in the enclosed space. "Melody, please," Elena hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the empty hallway, terrified that a banking executive might witness the domestic disturbance. "Have some dignity. Do not do this right now. We are minutes away from securing the future of this family. You are ruining a critical moment for your brother." The sheer magnitude of her delusion was breathtaking. She was staring at the daughter who had saved them from ruin 7 years prior. The daughter who had worked 80-hour weeks to keep their ledgers clean, and she was begging me to step aside so her parasitic son could commit federal wire fraud in peace. Hector remained seated at the center of the mahogany table. He did not bother to stand. He simply waved a thick, dismissive hand in my direction, not even granting me the respect of eye contact. "Let her stay, Elena," my father grumbled, opening a leather-bound folio. "If she wants to stand in the corner and watch how real business is conducted, let her watch. Maybe she will learn something about loyalty." They truly believed I was a defeated woman. They assumed I had spent the last 48 hours agonizing over my termination, crying in my apartment, and had now shown up in a pathetic, desperate attempt to beg for my job back before the ink dried. Their condescension was a coiled spring of dramatic tension winding tighter with every arrogant breath they took. They were handing me the exact psychological leverage I needed to make the impending reality check unimaginably satisfying. I looked down at my mother, whose hand was resting firmly on my forearm, attempting to steer me back out the door. I gently, but firmly, removed her hand from my sleeve. "Excuse me, Elena," I said softly. I did not argue. I did not engage with Derek's pathetic taunts or Hector's blind bravado. I simply brushed past them, walking with a measured, glacial calm down the length of the executive room. I bypassed the cluster of chairs surrounding my father. I bypassed the seat Derek had designated for himself. I walked to the very far end of the sprawling mahogany table, taking the chair situated at the true head of the room, directly opposite the entrance. I sat down, placing my black portfolio flat on the polished wood directly in front of me. Derek scoffed, returning to his seat, shaking his head at what he perceived to be a childish display of rebellion. He began arranging his paperwork, lining up the signature pages with meticulous, unwarranted pride. Elena took her seat beside Hector, casting anxious, disapproving glances down the table toward me, treating me like a stray dog that had wandered into a pristine dining room. I folded my hands over the cool leather of my briefcase and settled into the chair. The silence in the room stretched thick and suffocating. A sleek silver clock on the far wall ticked with rhythmic precision. The Allentown morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp beams of light across the fraudulent documents resting under my brother's hands. They decided to ignore my presence, writing me off as a bitter, powerless spectator. Hector leaned over, pointing to a specific clause in the loan agreement, whispering a joke to Derek. My brother laughed, a rich, confident sound that bounced off the glass walls. They were so remarkably certain of their victory. They had no idea they were sitting in a cage, rearranging the furniture while the lock clicked shut. I sat silently watching their chests rise and fall, watching the false confidence radiate from their pores. I did not need to speak. My documents would do all the talking required. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the hallway partition. The heavy, measured footsteps of a senior banking executive approached our enclosure. The brass door handle turned downward. The final countdown had reached 0. I kept my eyes locked on the door, waiting for the banker to step across the threshold and strike the match that would burn their empire to the ground. The heavy glass door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. Jonathan Alden stepped into the executive conference room. As the senior vice president of commercial lending for First Keystone, he possessed the calm, unshakable demeanor of a man who held the keys to the regional economy. He wore a conservative navy suit, a muted silk tie, and carried a thick crimson folder tucked securely under his left arm. He did not rush. Institutional capital never hurries. It demands that the world wait for its arrival. Derek immediately stood up, buttoning his jacket with practiced fluidity. He projected the image of a seasoned corporate titan, extending his hand across the wide mahogany table. "Good morning, Jonathan," my brother announced, his voice booming with artificial warmth. "We appreciate you carving out the time to finalize this restructuring. Castro Freight is ready to close this chapter and accelerate into the third quarter." Alden accepted the handshake with a polite, measured grip. He took his seat at the center of the table, directly across from Hector and Derek, placing the crimson folder flat on the polished wood. My father remained in his chair, offering a solemn patriarchal nod, while Elena beamed a radiant, blinding smile toward the banker. They were executing their designated roles flawlessly. I sat at the far end of the room, invisible and silent. Alden did not acknowledge me when he entered. He did not need to. We had never met in person, but his compliance department had spent the last 12 hours verifying my corporate identity, analyzing the injunctions drafted by my Philadelphia attorneys, and confirming the indisputable reality of my ownership. He knew exactly who was sitting in the corner chair. Derek wasted no time. He reached for the stack of consolidation documents, sliding the heavy staple-bound packet toward the center of the table. He launched into a rehearsed, charismatic pitch, outlining a vibrant, fictional future for our logistics firm. He spoke eloquently about capturing the Scranton shipping corridor, expanding the fleet with modernized Peterbilt tractors, and dominating the tri-state supply chain. He utilized polished corporate buzzwords, weaving a tapestry of projected revenue and synergistic growth. It was a brilliant performance, a masterclass in deflection. Derek assumed his charm could override the stringent underwriting protocols of a major financial institution. In his mind, banking was just another relationship to manipulate, a game of golf played indoors. He believed the sheer force of his personality could mask the rotting foundation of his phantom real estate debts. Hector nodded along with every word his son spoke, his chest swelling with undeniable pride. My father looked at Derek with total admiration, seeing a visionary leader rather than a desperate fraud. Elena mirrored the sentiment, her eyes shining as she watched her golden boy command the room. I listened to the hollow pitch, my hands folded neatly over my black leather portfolio. Modern American finance does not operate on charm. Commercial lenders do not issue multi-million-dollar lifelines based on a firm handshake and a confident smile. They lend based on verified equity, audited collateral, and pristine legal titles. Derek was treating this proceeding like a sales pitch, entirely ignorant of the rigid statutory requirements bearing down on him. Alden listened patiently, his face an unreadable mask. He allowed Derek to finish the grand soliloquy, letting the silence settle over the room for a few long, uncomfortable seconds. The silver clock on the wall ticked in the background. Then the banker opened his crimson folder. Mr. Castro Alden began, his voice smooth and remarkably even. "Your projections are ambitious. Everything regarding the routing numbers the principal requested and the standard amortization schedules appears to be in order for the capital restructuring. The preliminary credit checks on the corporate operating accounts have cleared our initial compliance review. Derek offered a triumphant, vindicated smirk. He turned his head slightly, shooting a quick, condescending glance in my direction. The look was meant to convey his ultimate victory, a silent reprimand, confirming that I was just a bitter spectator witnessing his coronation. However, Alden continued, his tone shifting into a colder, more clinical register. A consolidation loan of this magnitude, specifically one that encumbers the entire rolling stock of the company as secured collateral, requires adherence to strict corporate governance protocols. Hector leaned forward, a slight frown creasing his forehead. We provided the board resolutions, Jonathan. The executive committee authorized the debt restructuring unanimously yesterday afternoon. Alden turned his attention to my father. That authorization is invalid, Hector. Pledging the hard assets of a logistics firm requires the direct, verified signature of the majority shareholder. The operating officers cannot encumber the fleet without explicit consent from the primary equity holder. Derek scoffed, shaking his head as if the banker had just stated a minor typographical error. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and retrieved his expensive Mont Blanc pen. That is just a procedural formality, Jonathan, my brother said smoothly, uncapping the gold fountain pen. I am the chief executive officer. I hold the operational authority to execute these documents. I will sign the guarantor line right now, and we can move forward. Derek leaned over the mahogany table, pressing the tip of the pen toward the signature block on the first page of the loan agreement. Alden raised a hand, stopping the motion cold. You are the operating officer, Derek the banker stated, his voice dropping into a hard, unforgiving cadence. You own zero equity in this corporation. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Derek froze the gold nib of his pen, hovering a fraction of an inch above the paper. Hector bristled, his face flushing dark red. His pride surged to the surface, ready to defend his son. Now wait a minute, Alden. We have operated this firm under a proxy agreement for 7 years. Penn Iron Capital holds the paper, but they gave me the voting rights to steer this ship. I transferred that operational authority to my son. The proxy gives us the legal mandate to sign these documents. Alden did not flinch. He reached into his crimson folder and extracted a single, watermarked sheet of legal paper. He slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of my father. That was true until yesterday. Hector the banker replied quietly. Furthermore, Penn Iron Capital formally revoked your voting proxy yesterday evening. The injunction was filed with the state registry at 8 o'clock last night. You no longer possess any executive voting power. You are a minority shareholder with zero operational control. My father stared at the watermarked document. The color drained from his face, leaving a pale, sickly gray in its wake. His eyes darted across the legal text, reading the revocation of his authority in stark, undeniable black and white. Elena gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. What does that mean? She whispered, her voice trembling. Hector, what is he talking about? Who is Penn Iron Capital? Alden ignored her frantic question. He closed his crimson folder, squaring the edges meticulously. The corporate facade was entirely stripped away, leaving only the raw, mathematical truth of the situation. The bank was no longer negotiating with the false kings of Castro Freight. The senior lending officer turned his gaze away from the center of the table. He looked past Derek. He looked past Hector. He directed his attention down the long stretch of polished wood, locking eyes directly with me. We need the signature of the 51% owner, Alden announced, his voice carrying clearly to the far end of the room. Miss Castro, whenever you are ready. The room froze entirely. Time seemed to snap in half, suspended in a vacuum of sheer, suffocating shock. Derek stared at me, his eyes wide, his jaw slack. The false bravado, the tailored suit, the arrogant smirk, all of it melted away, revealing a terrified, cornered thief who suddenly realized the floor had vanished beneath his feet. The muscles in his hand went limp. The Mont Blanc pen slipped from his fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. The pen rolled lazily across the smooth surface, leaving a faint, jagged trail of black ink across the pristine loan application before finally coming to a rest against the wooden edge. The silence was absolute. It was a heavy, crushing realization pressing down on the chest of every person in the room. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. The scapegoat they had neglected, the daughter they had abused, the bookkeeper they had attempted to banish, was the true owner of the empire they claimed to rule. I sat in the corner chair, my hands resting on the black portfolio, and I watched their entire delusional world burn to ash. The echo of the gold fountain pen settling against the polished wood felt louder than a freight train horn sounding in the dead of night. Hector stared at the commercial banker, his thick chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. He shook his head, a slow, mechanical movement of total denial, unable to process the words hanging in the chilled air of the executive conference room. "There is a mistake," my father stammered. His voice, usually a booming instrument of authority on the loading dock, sounded thin and brittle, stripped of its customary bravado. "Jonathan, look at your underwriting files again. My daughter is a back-office accountant. She handles localized payroll and tax compliance. She does not have the private capital to fund a holding company. Penn Iron Capital is an institutional private equity firm operating out of a high-rise in Philadelphia. We correspond with their legal department." Alden did not argue. Institutional capital does not engage in petty debates. The senior vice president reached into his crimson folder and retrieved a thick stack of certified incorporation papers bound with a heavy embossed legal seal. He pushed the packet across the mahogany surface, the paper sliding with a soft hiss until it rested directly in front of my father. "The documentation is verified," Hector Alden stated, maintaining his clinical detachment. "Penn Iron Capital is a single-member limited liability company registered in the state of Pennsylvania. The sole managing director and primary equity holder is Melody Castro. She executed the buyout 7 years ago, injecting the necessary capital to clear your outstanding vendor debts and prevent foreclosure. She owns 51% of Castro Freight. The proxy voting rights you relied upon were granted by her, and they were revoked by her." Hector looked down at the embossed state seal. His eyes tracked across the lines of legal text, reading my name, printed in stark, undeniable black ink. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving a sickly, chalky pallor. The towering myth he had built around his own business acumen, the story of ruthless Philadelphia sharks respecting his gritty leadership, shattered into dust before his eyes. He had been working for me the entire time. Elena grasped the severity of the situation a fraction of a second before her husband did. Her survival instinct overrode her misplaced pride. She turned her gaze toward the far end of the table, her posture snapping from regal matriarch to desperate beggar. The haughty, condescending sneer she wore mere moments ago vanished, replaced by a trembling, frantic smile that did not reach her eyes. "Melody, sweetheart," Elena pleaded, her voice pitching up an unnatural octave echoing off the glass walls. "I knew you were smart, honey. We always knew you had a brilliant mind for finance. You saved our legacy once. Just sign the paperwork, please. We need to finalize this consolidation today, or the fuel suppliers will lock the gates tomorrow morning. Save your brother, sweetheart. We are a family." I looked at my mother. The word sweetheart tasted like ash in the sterile air. 2 days ago, she stood in her kitchen and accused me of being a jealous, paranoid saboteur trying to ruin her golden boy. 10 minutes ago, She tried to physically block me from entering this very room, treating me like a stray dog tracking mud onto a pristine carpet. Now, confronted with the reality of her impending poverty, she attempted to weaponize a motherly affection that had never truly existed. I did not acknowledge her plea. I unzipped the black leather portfolio resting on the table in front of me. The brass teeth parted with a smooth, decisive hiss. I extracted the forensic audit I had compiled overnight, a thick ledger of hard, irrefutable mathematics. I stood up from my chair and walked the length of the mahogany table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the terrazzo floor. I dropped the audit directly in front of Derek. The heavy thud of the paper made him flinch, his shoulders jumping toward his ears. I am not signing a single document to cover your theft, Derek, I said, my voice echoing with a cold, surgical precision. Hector blinked, tearing his eyes away from the incorporation papers, struggling to keep up with the shifting reality. Theft? What are you talking about, Melody? We are restructuring to cover unforeseen market fluctuations. The routing software requires an overhaul. There are no market fluctuations, Dad, I replied, turning to face him. Your golden boy has been bleeding the operating accounts dry for 8 months. He routed the diesel budget through a network of phantom consulting firms. He took the cash and funneled it into a failing commercial real estate syndicate in Scranton. He is buying collapsed strip malls and empty dirt lots, using the freight yard as his personal piggy bank. Derek gripped the arms of his leather chair. Sweat beaded along his hairline, ruining his polished executive facade. The flawless knot of his silk tie suddenly looked like a noose. She is lying, he stammered, looking frantically at Alden, then at our father, seeking a lifeline. She fabricated those numbers because she is bitter about the corporate restructuring. She is trying to sabotage my leadership. I reached back into my portfolio and pulled out the high-resolution satellite logs, laying them out next to the falsified fuel receipts. The GPS data places your trucks idling in empty lots in Lackawanna County, while the company credit cards were drained at truck stops 100 miles away. The math is not bitter, Derek. The math is exact. Hector stared at the satellite logs, his mind struggling to process the depth of the betrayal. But the financial bleeding was merely the prologue to the nightmare. I reached into my portfolio for the final, devastating revelation. I pulled out the origination documents from the shadow lenders in Delaware. I laid the mezzanine debt contracts down directly in front of my father, tapping my index finger next to the signature blocks on the bottom lines. He ran out of diesel money 3 months ago, I explained, maintaining my level gaze. The real estate market turned and his shell companies went underwater, so he began taking out high-yield loans against our Peterbilt tractors to cover his losses. But he lacked the executive authority to pledge the rolling stock as collateral. Hector leaned forward, his hands trembling as he adjusted his reading glasses. He stared at the signature resting on the page. He recognized the heavy-handed script, the rigid loops, the deep indentations in the paper. He also recognized the subtle, microscopic hesitations of a hand trying desperately to mimic his own rhythm. "That is not my signature," Hector whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a very old, very tired man. "No, it is not," I confirmed. "It is a forgery." Derek transmitted counterfeit financial documents across state lines to secure capital from predatory lenders. He did not just bankrupt this company, Dad. He committed federal wire fraud. When these shadow loans default next week, the lenders will not just send a repo agent to tow the trucks. They will send federal investigators with a warrant. Because your name is on the primary guarantor line, you are the one facing the grand jury. The horrific reality crashed over Hector in a devastating, suffocating wave. The son he idolized, the boy he crowned as a visionary corporate leader, had used him as a human shield against a federal indictment. Derek had risked his own father's freedom to cover a bad bet on a decaying strip mall. Derek scrambled to his feet, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. It crashed against the glass wall with a loud, ringing impact. "It was a temporary cash flow issue," Derek shouted, pointing a shaking, desperate finger at me. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed this bridge loan to float the properties until the commercial market rebounded. You do not understand executive risk. You just crunch numbers." His voice, usually a booming instrument of charm and manipulation, cracked under the immense pressure. It broke into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. He was no longer a towering CEO projecting power and influence. He was a terrified child caught stealing from the register, throwing a tantrum because the adults had finally turned on the lights. I reached into my portfolio one final time. I withdrew the stark white folder Derek had slid across my desk just 24 hours prior. I opened it to page 12 and placed it on top of the counterfeit loan applications, ensuring Jonathan Alden had a clear view of the text. "If it was a simple cash flow issue," I said, looking directly into my brother's panicked, bloodshot eyes, "then why did you hand me a severance agreement containing a blanket liability waiver? You tried to force me to retroactively absolve you of all fiduciary misconduct. You tried to legally immunize yourself before I could finalize the internal audit." Alden leaned forward, inspecting the specific clause I had circled in red ink. The senior banker shook his head in silent professional disgust. "The severance agreement was the undeniable proof of premeditated guilt. Derek knew he was committing a felony, and he tried to use my own professional termination as a shield to protect himself." Hector slumped back into his chair, the remaining fight draining out of his posture. He looked at Derek, seeing the fraud clearly for the very first time, stripped of all excuses and parental delusions. Then he looked at me. The scapegoat he had relentlessly abused, the daughter he had formally disowned and threatened just days prior, stood before him as the singular architect of his survival. The irony was a bitter, choking poison. Elena covered her mouth with both hands, stifling a ragged sob, her tears ruining her expensive makeup. The illusion of their elite status lay in ruins across the mahogany table, buried under a mountain of irrefutable evidence. They were not regional logistics titans shaping the Pennsylvania economy. They were the unwitting victims of their own blind favoritism, pushed to the very edge of ruin by the golden child they worshipped. I stood at the center of the room, looking down at the architects of my lifelong misery. The trap had sprung. The truth was out, and the power belonged entirely to me. It was time to pass the sentence. I did not raise my voice. There was no need for theatrical screaming or dramatic table pounding. Those were the tactics of the powerless, the desperate tools my father and brother used when they felt their control slipping away. I possessed the undeniable leverage of verified equity, which meant I could speak in a whisper and still dictate the fate of every person sitting in the room. I turned my attention away from my trembling family and looked directly at Jonathan Alden. The senior commercial banker sat perfectly still, observing the carnage with a stoic professional detachment. In the realm of institutional finance, emotion is a liability. Alden only cared about the mathematical truth resting inside his crimson folder. "Mr. Alden," I said, my tone mirroring his own clinical cadence. "As the verified majority shareholder and managing director of Penn Iron Capital, I am formally withdrawing this application for a commercial consolidation loan. Castro Freight will not be moving forward with any capital restructuring today. Furthermore, the underwriting documents submitted prior to this meeting contain fraudulent information manufactured without board consent." Alden closed his crimson folder, nodding once. His expression remained a blank professional slate. "Understood, Miss Castro. The application is officially nullified. The bank will flag the submitted paperwork for our internal compliance review given the irregularities you have brought to light." I shifted my gaze back to my brother. Derek was slumped against the glass partition, looking like a punctured tire. The bespoke tailoring of his charcoal suit suddenly seemed absurd, like a child wearing oversized clothing in a school play. Derek. I began letting the syllables hang in the chilled air of the executive suite. Effective at this exact second, your employment at Castro Freight is terminated. You are dismissed for gross fiduciary misconduct, embezzlement of corporate funds, and the unauthorized encumbrance of company assets. Your severance package is denied. Your corporate health benefits are revoked. You no longer possess any legal authority to act on behalf of this logistics firm. Derek opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to apologize, but only a raspy, pathetic wheeze escaped his throat. The charismatic sociopath had finally run out of lies. Hector finally found his voice. It was a hollow, desperate sound, echoing the profound collapse of his own patriarchal myth. Melody, wait, stop. My father pushed himself up from his leather chair, leaning heavily against the mahogany table. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, attempting to summon the booming authority he had wielded like a weapon for 3 decades on the loading dock. You cannot do this, Hector pleaded, his chest heaving. We can fix the ledgers. We can sell off a few of the older tractors, balance the books quietly. He is your brother. He made a mistake, a terrible error in judgment, but we are blood. We protect our own. You have to use the holding company to cover the mezzanine debt. We cannot let him go to federal prison. I stared at the man who had spent my entire existence treating me like an inconvenient shadow. The audacity of his request was staggering, yet entirely predictable. He was still trying to shield the son who had orchestrated his ruin. You want me to liquidate my legitimate equity? To pay off his illegal gambling debts? I stated, parsing his request into stark, unforgiving terms. You want me to reward his theft and sacrifice the financial stability of our 80 employees to keep your golden boy out of a courtroom. Hector reached out his hand, shaking palm up in a gesture of supplication. I am asking you to remember family loyalty, Melody. Please. I am begging you to save this family. The irony of his plea was a bitter, suffocating poison. 2 days ago, he stood in the executive suite demanding I sacrifice my pristine credit while threatening to disown me. He had handed me an ultimatum, fully expecting me to fold. Family loyalty, I repeated, letting the phrase roll off my tongue like a foreign language. I had long forgotten how to speak. I closed the black leather portfolio and zipped it shut with a sharp, decisive hiss. You spent my entire life telling me I had no stake in this family, I said, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. You told me I was a glorified calculator. You looked me in the eye and said I owed you for my existence. You drew the line, Dad. You were right. I picked up the portfolio by its sturdy handles. This is not a family anymore. It is a business, and I own it. Hector recoiled as if I had struck him across the jaw with a heavy steel pipe. He sank back into his chair, defeated, broken, the remaining fight draining out of his posture. I turned my attention back to the former chief executive officer. The key, Derek. I demanded, extending my open hand across the polished wood. Derek stared at my open palm. He hesitated, his fragile pride fighting a losing battle against the crushing reality of his situation. The brass heirloom was the physical manifestation of his unearned power, the symbol Hector had handed him during that arrogant Sunday dinner. Surrendering it meant acknowledging his total defeat. He reached into his trouser pocket with trembling fingers. He pulled out the heavy brass key our grandfather had forged decades ago. Derek placed the key into my hand. His skin was clammy slick with cold sweat. I closed my fingers around the chilled metal, reclaiming the legacy he had tried to steal and squander. I reached into my purse and retrieved my smartphone. I unlocked the screen, holding the device up so Hector, Elena, and Derek could witness the digital execution. I opened my contact list. I tapped my father's name, scrolling down to the stark red letters at the bottom of the profile. Block caller. I tapped the screen. Elena gasped, a sharp intake of breath, realizing the severity of my actions. I repeated the process for my mother, silencing the woman who had enabled my misery, the woman who had gaslighted my concerns to protect a thief. Finally, is blocked Derek. The technological severing was instantaneous, creating an impenetrable wall between my future and their toxicity. The boundaries were no longer theoretical suggestions or quiet hopes for better treatment. They were drawn in reinforced concrete. I would never answer another demanding phone call, never attend another degrading Sunday dinner, never listen to another empty boast. To be unequivocally clear, I said, addressing the room one last time, Castro Freight will not assume a single cent of the shadow loans. The Peterbilt tractors remain free and clear under my corporate governance. The predatory lenders operating out of Delaware will have to collect their debts from the man who forged the paperwork. I looked directly at Derek, ensuring he understood the gravity of his impending isolation. You are going to face those creditors entirely alone, I promised him. When the grace period expires, they will come looking for their capital. You built your house of cards, Derek. Now you get to sit inside it while it collapses. I turned away from the table. The emotional abusers were entirely stripped of their unearned power, their stolen wealth, and their fragile, fabricated narrative. They had nothing left to leverage. I walked toward the heavy glass door, my heels clicking with a steady, victorious rhythm. I did not look back. I stepped into the carpeted hallway of the financial district, leaving Hector, Elena, and Derek trapped inside the sterile conference room, sitting in total silence among the smoking ruins of the lies they had built. 6 months slipped by, transitioning the bitter Pennsylvania frost into a steady, cleansing spring rain. The Allentown freight yard looked remarkably different under the April gray. We scrubbed the fading Castro Freight logos from the corrugated steel warehouse doors, replacing them with the sharp, modern typography of Penn Iron Logistics. The transition was more than cosmetic. It represented a fundamental eradication of the toxic culture that nearly brought this property to ruin. I stood near the dispatch bay, a thermos of black coffee resting in my hand, observing the morning shift. The air buzzed with a renewed electric energy. A fleet of newly serviced Peterbilt tractors rumbled in perfect synchronization, waiting their turn at the loading docks. The paralyzing fear of frozen fuel accounts and bounced payroll checks was a ghost of the past. I spent the first 90 days executing a grueling forensic overhaul of every vendor contract. I flew to Pittsburgh to meet the diesel suppliers in person, spreading the unredacted audits across their conference tables. I showed them the mathematical truth of the prior mismanagement and outlined a rigid, transparent path forward. Trust, unlike empty corporate charisma, is earned through meticulous consistency. The credit lines reopened. The drivers returned to their designated routes. The structural hemorrhaging stopped. My parents vanished from the industrial district entirely. Hector and Elena vacated their sprawling suburban estate when the municipal property taxes became an insurmountable burden. I directed Donovan to construct an irrevocable, modest pension fund for them. The financial vehicle dispenses a strict monthly allowance sufficient to cover a quiet, downsized apartment on the outskirts of the county and their basic medical premiums. The arrangement contains 0 provisions for luxury vehicles, country club memberships, or lavish Sunday dinners. It operates purely on strict legal compliance, devoid of any residual affection. I did not design the trust out of daughterly devotion. I built it to ensure they could never claim destitution and drag my enterprise into a protracted dependency hearing. They lived their remaining years in a suffocating, mundane silence, forced to reckon with the irrefutable fact that they traded their legacy for a hollow mirage. My phone stays silent. The digital barricade I erected in the boardroom holds firm, shielding my peace from their lingering entitlement. The true poetic justice, however, unfolded away from those quiet retirement communities. When the Delaware shadow lenders realized the commercial consolidation loan had evaporated, they descended upon my sibling with the swift, unforgiving precision of starving predators. The phantom real estate syndicate in Scranton collapsed within weeks. The creditors seized the decaying strip malls, but the liquidated assets barely covered the accrued interest. To recover the principal, they filed severe civil litigation against Derek. The ensuing discovery process caught the attention of federal regulators, prompting a quiet but relentless inquiry into the forged mezzanine debt origination papers. Stripped of his fraudulent executive title, Derek found himself blacklisted across the entire white-collar sector. Corporate headhunters and logistics recruiters share a tightly knit network in this state. The moment the whispers of fiduciary misconduct and counterfeit signatures permeated the industry, his resume became a radioactive document. No reputable firm would grant him an interview, let alone hand him a corporate credit card. His tailored suits hung uselessly in a closet he could no longer afford to rent. The charismatic sociopath who built his identity on manipulation and unearned privilege suddenly crashed into a reality where charm held zero currency. Destitution is a brutal teacher. When his savings dried up and the legal bills mounted, Derek faced a profound reckoning. He possessed no tangible skills. He had never operated a forklift, never secured a payload, never navigated a supply chain without stealing someone else's calculations. He was a parasite, stripped of his host. Driven by sheer grinding desperation, he sent an email to the General Dispatch inbox of Penn Iron Logistics. He begged for a job. Any job. I did not delete the message. I approved his application for the lowest available position on the roster. I walked away from the dispatch bay, stepping out onto the damp concrete of the loading dock. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, chilling the air. I looked down the long line of active bays. At bay number 4, a crew of Tier 1 freight loaders wrestled a heavy pallet of industrial machinery into the back of a waiting trailer. Among them stood a man wearing a bright neon safety vest over a faded sweatshirt. He maneuvered a manual pallet jack, his boots slipping slightly on the slick concrete. His face was smeared with dark grease, his shoulders hunched under the intense physical strain of the manual labor. It was Derek. He was performing the exact grueling work he used to mock from the comfort of his climate-controlled office. The veteran drivers he once belittled now handed him cargo manifests, barking orders when his pace faltered. Hank, the driver, my sibling had publicly humiliated 6 months ago, stood near the cab of his rig, watching Derek secure the load with heavy nylon straps. Hank offered no sympathy, only a stern nod, demanding the task be done correctly. Derek paused, wiping his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the dock, and his eyes locked onto mine. We stood 30 yards apart. The roaring diesel engines created an insurmountable wall of sound between us. He looked exhausted, broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant prince who used to twirl a gold fountain pen. He saw me standing on the elevated platform, wearing a tailored wool coat, holding the very authority he tried to steal. I did not smile. I did not offer a condescending wave. I simply maintained a cold, stoic gaze, letting him feel the full, crushing weight of the hierarchy he had created. I watched his shoulders slump further. He broke eye contact first, turning back to the heavy wooden pallet forced to resume the back-breaking labor just to survive another week. I turned my back on the loading bay and walked toward the administrative building. The heavy brass yard key rested securely on my belt, a cool, constant reminder of the legacy I reclaimed. I climbed the stairs to the executive suite, my heels echoing in the quiet hallway. I stepped into my office, the space no longer a hidden sanctuary for a neglected bookkeeper, but the command center of a thriving empire. I walked to the expansive window, looking out over the rolling peaks of the Appalachian horizon. The air up here was clear, untainted by the toxic delusions of my past. I never sought petty revenge against my family. I did not purchase their affection, nor did I demand their apologies. Apologies are cheap, hollow currencies traded by people who lack the fortitude to change their behavior. I chose a different path. I utilized the precise, unforgiving language of mathematics and corporate law to expose their false narrative. They spent 3 decades demanding I remain invisible, insisting the empire would never belong to me. They failed to realize that while they were busy building a stage to perform their grand illusions, I was quietly buying the theater. I enforced the undeniable truth, securing the futures of the men and women sweating in the yard below. The roaring engines outside served as a constant testament to that victory. The people who make the least noise, who analyze the ledgers while the charismatic fools shout into the void, are the ones who ultimately hold all the leverage. Every family keeps a ledger. These internal accounting systems are rarely written on paper, yet they govern the quiet spaces between Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and hushed conversations in the kitchen. In the story of the Castro family, we witnessed a profound financial reckoning inside a sterile bank conference room. But the true bankruptcy occurred decades earlier. The spectacular collapse of Hector and Elena's legacy was not merely a matter of forged signatures or mismanaged logistics. It was the inevitable culmination of a profound failure in parental responsibility. A stark warning about what happens when mothers and fathers prioritize comfortable illusions over the difficult, uncompromising demands of honesty and fairness. Within the traditional American family structure, there is a deeply ingrained desire to pass the torch, to build a generational legacy that validates the parents' hard work and sacrifices. We idolize the charismatic successor, the bold entrepreneur who commands the room with a firm handshake and a confident smile. Hector and Elena fell victim to this cultural archetype. They looked at their son Derek and saw the gleaming reflection of their own aspirations. They wanted a golden boy to carry the Castro freight name into the future. And their desire for that picturesque outcome blinded them to the reality of his hollow character. True parenting, however, requires a rigorous, unflinching emotional awareness. It demands that we see our children not as extensions of our egos, but as autonomous individuals with distinct strengths and fatal flaws. By refusing to acknowledge Derek's incompetence and manipulative nature, Hector and Elena did not protect their son. They crippled him. They constructed a padded reality where his failures were constantly attributed to external factors, market fluctuations, clerical errors, or bad luck. They handed him unearned titles and brass keys, shielding him from the fundamental friction of the real world. In doing so, they stripped him of the opportunity to develop genuine resilience. When a child is never allowed to fail, they never learn how to rebuild. The parents' lack of fairness ultimately transformed their son into a fragile parasite, a man who possessed no moral compass and no actual skills, leaving him utterly defenseless when the artificial walls of his kingdom finally fell. Conversely, their treatment of Melody reveals the darker side of this parental delusion. In their desperate bid to maintain Derek's illusion of supremacy, Hector and Elena actively erased the quiet, sustaining labor of their daughter. Melody became the designated shock absorber for the family's dysfunction. She was expected to labor in the shadows, to sacrifice her own resources, and to endure constant belittlement, all while watching the credit for her brilliance be handed to someone else. This dynamic highlights a tragic misunderstanding of family responsibility. Duty is not a one-way street where a child is obligated to bleed themselves dry to sustain their parents' pride. When we raise children, the standard of fairness must be the bedrock of the household. Fairness does not mean treating every child exactly the same, but it does mean acknowledging the truth of their contributions and holding them to an equal standard of accountability. Hector and Elena demanded unconditional loyalty from Melody, while offering her conditional, transactional affection in return. They failed to realize that emotional neglect is just as corrosive as physical absence. A traditional family cannot survive when its foundation is built on a hierarchy of deception. The resentment that festers in the overlooked child will eventually calcify into a hardened protective shell, severing the emotional bonds that the parents assume will last forever. The long-term guidance of children requires an unwavering commitment to honesty, not just telling the truth, but living in accordance with reality. If a family is to thrive, the living room must be a place where hard truths can be spoken without the fear of retaliation or disownment. Hector and Elena created an environment where the truth was viewed as a hostile threat. When Melody attempted to present the forensic reality of the company's decay, she was met with gaslighting and fury. Her parents preferred the comforting warmth of Derek's lies to the chilling breeze of Melody's facts. This willful ignorance is the ultimate parental abdication. It teaches children that appearances are more valuable than integrity, and that performance is more rewarded than substance. The fallout in that Allentown bank was simply the universe balancing an equation that had been distorted for 32 years. Melody did not destroy her family. The family destroyed itself through 1,000 tiny daily acts of enabling and denial. By the time the ink dried on the bank's rejection, the familial bonds were already ash. Stories like the Castros are rarely told aloud. They are hidden behind the manicured lawns of suburban neighborhoods and the polished glass of corporate suites. They are the silent tragedies of the American dream, whispered only in the quiet aftermath of broken legacies. If you find yourself resonating with these raw, unspoken truths of human dynamics, and if you seek a deeper understanding of the complex emotional tapestries that bind and break us, I invite you to follow Jessica Told Stories. Here, we shed light on the shadowed corners of the human experience, bringing voice to the quiet resilience of those who refuse to be erased. As we look at the wreckage of the Castro Empire, we are forced to reevaluate the very definition of loyalty. We are taught from a young age that blood is thicker than water, that family is an unbreakable covenant requiring endless sacrifice. We are conditioned to believe that forgiveness is a moral imperative and that keeping the family unit intact is the highest virtue a person can achieve. But this conventional wisdom masks a dangerous fallacy. The most profound betrayal a parent can commit is not financial ruin. It is the demand that a child shrink their soul to maintain a comfortable illusion. Love without accountability is merely a hostage situation dressed up in holiday traditions. The unconventional, uncomfortable truth is this: blood does not entitle anyone to your sanity, and endurance is not always a virtue. Sometimes the purest act of love you can offer a profoundly broken family is to let them fall. By walking away, you force them to finally meet the unyielding pavement of reality. As you examine the ledgers of your own life, ask yourself, who is holding the pen? Are you honoring the quiet laborers in your home, or are you handing brass keys to the loudest voices? And more importantly, if the audit of your own family history were laid bare across a mahogany table tomorrow, would you be the architect of a lasting legacy, or just another custodian of a beautiful, empty lie?